can't do that when it's rolling. Can you hear her? Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, am I muted? Welcome to Magic Without
There you go.
Fears, the Hermetic podcast. We're live. Sorry there, I was muted, still learning this technology of live streaming. Welcome, Jacob. Good to have you here, man. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm glad you could fit this in and go ahead a snack. I've got my coffee, so I won't fall asleep. But like I was saying before we went live, theater kids like us never really get bored, do we? We always have stuff to talk about.
I'll keep you awake, trust me.
Oh, I'm not in danger of falling asleep. This is gonna be fun. So, here's a theater line from you. Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
Oh man,
isn't that the question in Wizard of Oz? I think so.
Wizard of Oz, yes. I think good. I think more of a fairy than a witch, maybe. No, I'm a witch too.
Yeah, well, Fairy Wicca was definitely my first love when I turned away from the spirituality I grew up in. And it was, DJ Conway's Celtic Magic book in 1994, I think, or 93, that really changed my trajectory in life. What was it? Did you have a book like that?
Well, I had a series of circumstances. So wait, what is the spirituality you grew up in?
Transcendental meditation.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. A quick story about transcendental meditation. When I studied in Spain at a kind of podunk suburban university, David Lynch did come to give a talk at this university where almost nobody spoke English. He gave the talk in English to an auditorium of mostly Spaniards, and it was exclusively about transcendental meditation. I think everyone thought he was going to talk about like Twin Peaks and all of that. Right. And he had like an overhead projector where he like drew the little layers of consciousness. So I've always been very fascinated with transcendental meditation, but alas, I didn't have the money to try it at the time.
Right. Well, you've touched on one of my favorite things about it. I have a lot of favorite things about transcendental meditation. I think it's a wonderful meditative practice. I'm not a fan of spiritual bypassing, and it naturally, I think, like every spiritual tradition has its negative side, right? Obviously, that's something the last 2,000 years can definitely agree on. And I think for TM, the negative side is it tends toward giving. It's so good at doing the thing that allows spiritual bypassing to happen that it's very tempting to not use it that way. And in growing up in my family environment, an extended family environment with my godfather who runs the TM organization in Canada, and who, David Lynch stays with them when he comes here for the events that they do. Wow. Yeah, it's just, I saw that. That's how I saw it being used. How I saw it playing out in the lives of the people who were very respected externally, if you weren't inside the family, and it was rough. It was rough. I mean, it would have to be for me to go from yoga to Catholicism.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your original question, context-wise, I was brought up in deep and intense kind of culty Christianity. And as far as a book that sort of pulled me away from it, I would say the earliest books that I read that pulled me away from just like the dogma would probably be his Dark Materials, the Philip Pullman books, which are obviously not theoretical, they're fictional, but I think the character in the ending who is a lesbian who leaves the church because she has a queer encounter and sort of decides that she can't believe in a god or an authority, quote unquote, that thinks that's evil. That is something that I think stuck really deep inside of me and then affected me much later in my life. As far as a transformational sort of spiritual text, I would say the two for me are, of course, Arthur Evans's Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, and also Theocritus's Idol 2, which I've talked about on another podcast, so I won't belabor it too much. But Theocritus is sort of lampooning witchcraft and femininity and magical femininity, and that aspect of it definitely went over my head when I was like 19 or 20, and I was like, whoa. Poetry is witchcraft. I've already been doing this. And so that's kind of, in a way, a lot of the texts that pulled me away from the spirituality I grew up into kind of pagan spirituality. A lot of them were fictional or mythic texts and poetic texts, and that's just kind of how I accessed a lot of that early on. And as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of fictional texts, there's a lot of buried spirituality in a lot of them. And so those are the kinds of things that had like a really deep impression on me.
Yeah, the role of fiction. I mean, the Necronomicon is a fictional grimoire that people use, but the Gospels are literal, true historical events, right? That people use. So there's a difference. I mean, right? There's the problem. Like, the further we go back into our own truths, the more we discover, that a lot of them are just stories. They're just stories.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying I'm a Christian, but I still understand the story element of them, and I understand the narrative traditions of those times, right? Like, imagine if you're compiling these stories and then you hear of someone else's prophet doing a kind of miracle, and your prophet didn't do that kind of miracle. Well, you've got to put that in there. So you might see an insertion in the text, right, where it's like, oh, well, every Messiah had to do that miracle because it was considered kind of essential in the Messiah literature of the first century, and that's what that whole creative process that went into the early Bible construction I find really fun and fascinating. It's one of the things I enjoyed the most about seminary, because it also unlocked my love of understanding ancient Irish and Celtic texts, right? Growing up in the Celtic fairy magical milieu, which I was obsessed with. I was always trying to get the best source texts for the Celtic traditions I love, which was mostly the Gaelic ones, so Scotland and Ireland. There's a bit of a tradition on the Isle of Man, but I think the language of Manx is their biggest contribution to Celtic culture, probably. Then again, I just might not know the mythology. So sorry, Manx folks out there, all 10 of you. I love you, and I hope to visit soon. So yeah, being able to unpack those early Celtic traditions and myths and realize how much Christianity was, how much of them were written down simply to insert Christianity into those early Irish myths written down in the medieval periods, like, the Táin Bó Cúailnge and the Din Descentia and the Books of Invasions, Labr na Gabala, and all those things. So yeah, you mentioned in your bio you have a love of these Celtic traditions as well. So I thought we could chat about that, as well as I want to talk to you about the role of poetry and music and art and theater in the life of a practitioner and magical witchy people.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I've belabored a lot in academia, because I sort of come from the MFA workshop model, and before that, even undergraduate creative writing workshops are very based on this MFA model. And it's sort of a model that prizes, at least in the fiction and storytelling side of things, sort of literary realism or psychological realism over everything else, and kind of doesn't take a lot of other stuff seriously. And for me, it's almost a spiritual project to get academic literary snobs to understand, like, first of all, fairy tale, folktale, and myth making are where you get the principle of the short story and the principle of fiction, right? Like, oral storytelling and eventually written storytelling was spiritual in nature and then fantastical in nature. And most of the early short stories, as they are, or picaresques as they are some version of an explosive sort of fairy tale. And so I think, I don't know, fairy tale and myth as the root of like Western storytelling is really important. And I would say also, you know, fairy tale and myth to me, it's like all story, in a way, like all stories are real, right? They're like a way of illustrating some kind of truth or some kind of a reality. So whether they are like rooted in sort of physical visible reality or some kind of like a spiritual reality, I think it's just as valid. And I don't have to tell you this because I'm on a witchy podcast that a lot of witchy people like to listen to. But in sort of the academic spheres, at least the ones that I came up in as a writer and as a researcher and all of this kind of stuff, like these kinds of narratives just kind of weren't taken seriously. And so I consider it in some ways kind of a project to get those kinds of stuffy people to understand, like, no, actually, this is where you get what you think is serious literature comes from this stuff that you're kind of disparaging. And of course, some of it comes from a hostility toward like genre fiction, as it were. But, you know, and there's crappy, obviously, there are plenty of crappy fantasy books, but there are also plenty of crappy, you know, coming of age stories. So I don't know. Do with it what you will. Not that that doesn't really get into the spiritual elements of it too much, but the magic of storytelling and like magic in storytelling, I think, is like really important.
Absolutely. And a lot of people point to the best stories winning out, right? This was always been sort of our hermeneutic approach to gauging what stories and how, whether a story is important. But in, you know, postmodernism, there's a bit more skepticism about the stories that survived are obviously the best and most true, right? This would be a narrative that Christians would very much perpetuate, but really any group who's dominant would want to perpetuate that idea, which is when it was very interesting to think about that in analyzing ancient texts, right? Like, so a lot of people would say, throw out the Chaldean oracles, because if they were any good, then they would have survived, right? If there was real truthful depth and reality to them, they would have survived. And that just discounts the you know, the agenda that empire can have.
Yeah, I was going to say that's
it marches across the globe. Yeah. So we have this really interesting like tension between the stories that survive being important, but also the stories that don't survive being important. And it's kind of like those movies that get really high ratings and really low ratings. It's like, it's the ones in the middle that usually suck, but the ones at the extreme ones, like if it has a really low rating, it might be a really good movie, right? That's where you find the cult classics and things like that. Often is like really shitty rated movies, but they're actually amazing. And just like, you know, sorry.
Oh, it's just like, it's an intensely capitalist and colonialist thing to say, like, oh, the things that survive are the best ones, right? It's like right now the things that are making the most money are like Marvel movies or whatever. And
not anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, same thing with like, yeah, the idea of religious or spiritual traditions dying out because they're not as true or not as real. I think as we see kind of imperialism implode on itself, it's kind of like, well, maybe this like value system that has justified all of this stuff and like swept all this other sort of fringe or old spirituality isn't what's going to like sustain us as a species in the long term, and certainly isn't going to sustain the planet in the long term, right?
Yeah, I suppose not. The fringe, well, you know, Justin Sledge said on his video, I think, I don't remember, I'm trying to catch up on things that I've missed the last 40 days in my life because I've been out of touch. Right. And he mentioned about magic, you know, and he was talking about the persecution of magic in history through like the Middle Ages and into the Liber Iuratus, which then got taken up very popularly and led to the Arbatel and all that. But he pointed out, just, he was like, you know, they used violent force to stamp out magic for centuries, and they lost. Like, congratulations, magic. He said, it's like, you won. You won. Because like looking around the world, and it's funny from his perspective because he's a materialist, right, and doesn't believe in it. It's just funny to think he's looking around like, damn, you know, yep. Who would have thought that the magical worldview would have triumphed over it's being seen as you know, witchcraft and heresy and black magic. I mean, it's still seen that way by most people, but you know, then there's a lot of people that think all Christians are fundamentalists, so it's
Right.
It's always got that problem. Yeah. Yeah, the triumph of magic. It's interesting, and this has really made it an amazing time for artists to engage with that material. I like you've got a book coming out. Tell people about the book you've got coming out. It's a book of short stories.
Yes.
And while I got to listen to your album a couple times, which I really enjoyed, I put on the good studio headphones so I could hear everything. And it was really nice. I really enjoyed it. It's up my alley. So very symphonic and magical Bowie-esque melodies and lyrically driven. I got less far in your book. Thanks for the advanced reader's copy. I will continue to read your short stories. But yes, tell people about this interesting collection of short stories, because I think it's very, very, very interesting. I'm not the target reader, I will say. So I got through the first story, but once you've read, and people, when you go read the first story, you'll see why it's like, I'm not the target reader. That's not a diss. It's like a orientation thing.
Yeah.
But it was fun.
Yeah, so Tea Leaves came out last year. I went on a pretty extensive tour for it, which was kind of crazy and life-changing and mystical in a lot of ways. But basically, yeah, Tea Leaves is a collection of what I would call queer magic realist short stories, or sort of, I like to joke that my thesis as an artist is like remythologizing queerness instead of demythologizing it, which is to say there's a generation of queer writers that came before me for whom I think, for like very necessary societal reasons, sort of felt like assimilation was the path towards survival, right? And so there's like a literary tradition of like gay, lesbian, trans writers who are writing things that are trying to be like, listen, like queer people are just like you. We're just living normal lives, except sometimes our friends die of HIV or experience violence or whatever. And I don't mean to disparage that movement of queer literature, but I think we've moved beyond a place where we need to prove to people that we're just like everybody else, and move into a world where it's like the triumph of contemporary queerness is that it's not like what society has prescribed for a person's life trajectory, and that's probably a good thing. And so I didn't really set out to write this book with that sort of project in mind. I just wrote a lot of short stories through a lot of workshops and through my MFA program, and got like lots and lots of feedback on it. And if, worked my way up through publishing individual stories and things like that until I had kind of enough pieces published to think about putting them together into a book. And so, yeah, so it's sort of like, I think some of the pieces veer into the realm more of like fantasy, and then a lot of them veer more into the realm of sort of magic realism or like psychological realism, where there's some individual element about the world that's like warped a little bit. So there's a lot of kind of esoteric philosophy that inspires it or informs it. My favorite piece to read live is And Then Again to the Next, which is a piece about reincarnation. It's about a pair of people who meet across reincarnations in doomed cities, told from the perspective of one person that remembers all of their past lives, and is trying to kind of work on the relationship across different lives, and the timing of when whatever city they're in sort of falls apart or becomes doomed may or may not be informed by what's going on between the two of them. Often it's not. Often they're just getting things right, and then there's fire from the sky and stuff. And so that's a piece, for example, that merges like historical catastrophe like Pompeii and Alexandria and, San Francisco in the early 20th century with, stories across myths. So there's like a portion of it that takes place in the city of Is. There's a portion of it that takes place in the ancient city of Bab-edra, which is often sort of cited as evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's basically a city that experienced a lot of destruction that there's archaeological evidence of. And so it's just sort of like merging a lot of those things, but also to explore the ways that, like, I don't know, for a lot of queer people, I think, this is a character going through a very singular experience, right? Like they can't talk to other people about their relationship problems because they're taking place over like centuries and lifetimes. And so I think there's an element of sort of like, I think a lot of queer people can't, for a lot of their lives, talk to everyone about what they're going through in their relationships. And also, I think for a lot of queer people, because of what you internalize when you're growing up and things like that, like every relationship kind of feels like it's doomed from the start, or everything feels really dire, or like you feel like you're going to live a short life because your peers have lived very short lives, either because of HIV or dying by suicide or brutality or whatever. So I don't mean to be like, or whatever, but name your thing that shortens the lifespan of the people around you. And so it's a lot of stuff like that. It's not all heavy. A lot of it, as the piece that you read to start out, a lot of it is very lighthearted and a lot of it is very satirical. But then some of it is like deals with these sort of heavier things through the lens of like mythopoesis, for instance, or like re-mythologizing contemporary experience.
So Live is the one with the past life, was working through it over different times. Yeah. That's in
That one's called, it's called And Then Again to the Next.
Okay,
is the name.
I'll read that one next. That sounds fun.
That one is
you're a good writer, and it reads well and it flows well. It's good stuff. And yeah, there's some things I like about your style. The first story,
Okay.
I mean, I unfortunately only read the first story. I blame that on your music, as a when you write and play music, it's hard to. I was trying to do both at once, but then that was hard and all that. I was in that first story, there's an interesting conflation between what seems to be kind of the spiritual awakening or psychical awakening and the sexual awakening.
Yeah,
and it's like an interplay between those two awakenings. And you're not what, and it created an interesting tension and constant surprise, because I kept subverting my expectations of thinking there'd be some revelation about the nature of the spiritual experience, but then you like got me with the left hook, and it's like boom, sex, and I was like, oh shit, I didn't see that coming. Okay, we're gonna have some fun. you keep going with it, and that was so it caught me by surprise. I really, really was surprised. I was like, shit, okay. I also found, was this intentional? I hope it was, and if you're welcome to lie and say it was if it wasn't. Was it intentional that the character in that story scene sort of had a built-in hypocrisy with the woman at work? Her assumption that he would be interested in her friend just because they're gay, but then when he goes and sees a stranger online, that's where his mind straight goes to, even though that's not the purpose for their connection, right? Their purpose for their so there's meant to be that. Okay, that was
well, I think the character of Ron is one of those, I think, just intensely lonely people that thinks his loneliness is like everybody else's fault, and then just goes through, like, just has this like sort of instant critical instinct of other people. And of course, like, that is usually because somebody is very self-critical, right? If they're going around kind of clocking everybody else. And so, you're dealing with sort of this character that's intensely lonely, and doesn't really know how to break through his loneliness, because he's like, oh, I'm trying to talk to people and connect with them, and why won't they connect with me? And it's like, well, it's because you're like kind of bitchy and not really open to that kind of connection. And so, it is like, I think there's also a thing where like gay people are really hostile toward the idea of straight women trying to set them up with somebody, because it's like there's a separate thing that goes on where, like, if you meet a certain type of straight women, like the second thing out of her mouth is her trying to set you up with her gay best friend. So that's like kind of a thing that goes on there. But you're meant to, I think, kind of be critical of this character who just has like knee-jerk negative opinions about other people and is just sort of like a no person. And I think I try to be subtle about it because I am dealing with sort of a literary audience on my best of days, but just the idea that like once he starts seeing these fairies, he sort of becomes open to other ways of seeing, and like other ways of seeing people and other ways of seeing himself. And like I try not to overdo it. There's a maximalist version of me that thinks like, oh, there could have been a version of this story where like everybody on this Reddit thread kind of meets up and has a sort of like hedonistic fairy like gathering of the nature of like the little tiny glowing fairies that they see. But I was like, it has to be, I think in real life and in also in spiritual life for me, it has to be a sense of like everything is still incremental, right? And everything that we experience, it's not like your life is going to change overnight. That might happen for some people, but like you start to open yourself up to different ways of seeing. And that doesn't mean that you suddenly like go out and win the lottery or like get a huge promotion. It means like oftentimes that you take small steps toward the things that you want. And so I tried to be subtle about that sort of shift in this character. But yeah, the hypocrisy of this character of being like, I don't want to talk to your gay friend, and then being like, oh, but is he gay? Is he
Is this
cute?
guy on
Is he
Reddit into
single?
me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like,
But the
exactly.
interesting part is that it's the spiritual revelation that is breaking him out of his routine and forcing him to go change other aspects in his life and find fulfillment. So that's, yeah, it was a fun little, so I'm a fan of the short story art form. I definitely am. I've always been a fan of like Flannery O'Connor and James Joyce's short stories and a whole bunch of others. What were some of your major literary influences that decided it's no small decision to pursue a master's in fine arts? I've had many friends who have gone that path, and they're incredibly creative and interesting people. So, what's part of the literary and philosophical journey that led you to do that instead of become a politician?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer the question about influences first, I guess contemporary influences, at least for like storytelling, I would say Kelly Link was a huge influence on me. Neil Gaiman was a huge influence on me. American Gods, I think, in a way. Again, I keep talking about spiritual awakenings by way of fiction, but I think that's kind of my whole thesis as an artist, is like my whole body of work in a way I wouldn't say is about spiritual awakening for other people, but I feel like I'm presenting an act of sort of ritual catharsis by creating work. I actually think all artists are doing that, really, and I think a lot of my work is just kind of calling it what it is, right? But yeah, I mean American Gods was a huge mind opener for me about just thinking of spirituality and spiritual practices as these sort of like cultural archetypes, which they obviously always have been. But at 15 years old, in like a fundamentalist reality, I had just never really thought about it that way. So yeah, I'm somewhat ashamed to say that Neil Gaiman had like an enormous influence on me as a writer. Kelly Link is a huge influence. And then beyond that, I think I was really, really, I mean, what uh what pagan did not at one point have a huge Greco-Roman phase in their life? I think that was the most easily accessible alternative spiritual practice when I was younger that I could like learn about and sort of like easily access the pantheon on. So when I was younger, that was like a pretty big influence on me. And I would say from that, most of the witch stuff, I mean, Theocritus's second idyll, I don't give a shit about any of his other idylls. No offense, but they're not about witches. Medea, Euripides' Medea had a pretty big influence on me. The Bacchae, also of Euripides. So kind of all over the map. But as far as pursuing an MFA in creative writing, I am a multidisciplinary artist. So the decision really was like, if I'm going to formalize this part of my education in some way, I hate to put it this way, but like, what is the most practical way that I can do that? And for me, on a number of levels, like a fiction degree made the most sense. Because first of all, like storytelling is the first art form I was interested in. Second of all, it kind of like analyzing story structure in and of itself will bear weight and influence on everything else that I do as an artist, from songwriting to poetry to theater to performance art, right? Like, it's like story arc is pervasive in everything. And then I think for teaching college, which is what I wanted to do when I started grad school, it's all the MFA is supposedly all a terminal degree, but I think like focusing on prose, either fiction or nonfiction, is just the clearest pathway to teaching college English. So these are all things that kind of factored in. I looked also at multidisciplinary MFA programs, but I just sort of thought, well, I can't. I'm already I'm already so scattered. I think if I go to an MFA, I think I need to like focus on one thing and get really, really good at it, and hope that it influences everything else, instead of continuing to like throw spaghetti at the wall, which is like basically my artistic practice. But as far as why that instead of another career path, I don't know. You just like, because you're a spiritual and creative person, it's like, it's just something you kind of can't not do if it's in you. And I was pre-law when I started college, but that very quickly it very quickly became clear to me that I enjoyed research and I enjoyed the performance of litigation, but I was not interested ethically or spiritually in like the life of a lawyer. I don't know. I look back and I think maybe I could have been an environmental lawyer. That would have been fulfilling, but I'm glad I didn't. For me, no, I'm thrilled that there are people out there doing environmental law, for instance, or immigrant law. But I didn't even process that as an option when I was younger. So yeah, I just was like, I have to be an artist. I have to create a life for myself that I can sustain a living as an artist. Teaching is that life. Fiction is the form that I will focus on for a formal degree, because I think it'll have the best effect on everything else that I do. Not the most concise answer, but Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that's a good answer, especially for people who are, in university or on the fence about it and that sort of thing. The path of writing feeds into so many other skill sets and career paths. Yeah, developing your ability to write. I know more and more people are going to throw that out as the AIs improve, but no matter how good an AI gets at writing, it's never going to be able to express your thoughts. And that's something I think people are missing. It's like, those aren't your thoughts. Parameters aren't thoughts. And one of the things we learn as writers, as we keep writing and writing and writing, is how many layers there are to our thoughts, how much depth there is behind them when you start to unpack them through the process of writing. But that process doesn't happen if you're just asking Siri to make you a paragraph, right?
Yeah.
Looks like we have a lawyer watching us in the morning, so that's always fun.
I mean no offense to the profession of law.
Maybe
and
she
in
was
fact,
just in law school. Rachel Rose says, I am totally chaotic in my artistic and spiritual practices. Glad I am not alone. No, you're not alone in the chaos. I mean, the chaos is that from which we create form. So we need to learn to deal with it. And that's where the flexibility of art, I think, comes in. The last month of my life, as everyone knows, has been a hell I could never have imagined. Yeah. And as we were trying to plan and plot our interview, you kept trying to give me more leeway. But what I couldn't express to you was that's actually something that for me to deal with the chaos in my family now and in the world following my sister's death, I actually have to become more structured to deal with that chaos, right?
Yeah.
There's a place for flexibility and being chill, but not necessarily in places someone might think. And that's part of the creative process as well, right? You need to be flexible to the unpredictableness of and following your thoughts and feelings. Otherwise, it's not art. But you also then have to become more scheduled and strict about that process and planning podcasts and time to write and time to do this. Otherwise, you'll spend all your time just staring at the floor or crying. So, in my case, for the family tragedy, but it's still similar to the artistic process. And that's interesting. You created something that I'm very fascinated by, and definitely this will be the reason I want to talk to you again in the future, because every time I pick up this book, I never manage to get through it. There's always something comes up and I'm like, oh, I can't devote time to it. But you adapted Bulgakov's The Master and the Margarita.
Mm-hmm.
And how did that go? Why did you do it? It's a story in which the devil and his retinue of demons visit in an intensely atheist Moscow. And it's also the title. It was even titled by the title was used by the Canadian band The Tea Party for one of their songs. So if you don't want to read read the book, folks, you can go listen to the song and totally not have a sense of what the book's about. It's just a song. But this fellow Jake here you adapted it into a stage performance. Tell us. I'm so curious. Yeah, tell me all about that.
Yeah, it's funny. With theater, it's such, in a way, an ephemeral experience but it's also something that's like so all consuming creatively that, like, I don't know, it's kind of wild. I have documentation of this play, but it's been like 8 years since I did that. So but I still feel like it was so recently, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I was 22 when that play went up, which was pretty crazy. But it was just one of those things where I do think that Bulgakov was also a child of the theater. I think he worked in a theater. And so there is just something like so theatrical about the work itself, and so theatrical about the way that he constructs characters in his work, that I want to say, like, 2 chapters into reading this book, which I was reading when I was in college, I was like, oh, this needs to be adapted into a play. I just was like, this has to happen. And I was signed up basically to take an adaptations for stage class at the time. And I was just like thinking about that already. And then I started working on it when I was probably 18 or 19 years old. And just kind of reading through it and underlining things and being like, this is how I would do this and this is how I would do that. So I hadn't even like gotten 3 chapters into the book before I started annotating it as if I would make it into a play. And of course, it's a Russian novel, so there are like hundreds of characters with, multiple different ways of saying their name. So it's a lot to keep track of from a theatrical standpoint. I had 10 actors. I think I pared the story down to about 100 characters, which is a major feat for that book. And it was amazing. I was working. So I adapted a portion of it for this class when I was like maybe a sophomore or junior in college, but I never really let go of the idea of doing it. And I just kind of let it alone. And then when I was a junior in college, I started working locally with an experimental kind of DIY, very like warehousey theater company, which, by the way, you want to talk about going down a rabbit hole into fairyland. Like Baltimore from 2009 to like 2016 was just this crazy wonderland of super experimental avant-garde shoestring budget art in these like huge, extremely not up to code spaces that were just like immersive and crazy. And so I fell in with kind of that milieu, and that scene has since kind of fallen apart for a number of reasons, but I kind of fell in with that milieu. A lot of it was luck and circumstance that led me to be able to sort of pitch this play. Luck and circumstance, or divine providence, if you will. Which is just kind of, I was like the age and energy and sort of like right mental illness for a lot of really high profile roles in productions that did really well. I was in a production of Equus when I was 19, where I was like, had to be naked on stage, and like, which was like terrifying. And I was not mentally well, but because I was like not mentally well, I was like pretty electric in this play. And I had a few kind of really lucky things like that sort of got people in the scene really interested in what I was doing and what I was thinking about. And so I kind of played the long game with it. I mean, I started thinking about adapting it when I was like 18. I finished reading it. I adapted like maybe a third to half of it for this class. I worked on it again for a little bit. And then I just sort of like worked as a theater and performance artist in Baltimore for long enough that eventually, when the company I was working with was pitching, I had wormed my way into a resident actor position. And I just in the pitching meeting was like, I have this project that I think is going to kind of blow people's minds. And I had had so much time to think about how I would pitch it to people that they bought what I was selling. And it was crazy. I mean, it was a little over 3 hours, which I feel still guilty about 8 years later, but people loved it. I mean, it was, I sold out most of the shows and like standing room only. And it ended up being really successful because it's a really, really popular book, but also because like the spirit of this theater company and sort of my vision for it and the design team, we went like really all in. And we didn't have a huge budget for it, but like the costumer was working in a couple different vintage clothing stores. So she made some clothes, but she also just like altered lots of like insane vintage clothes. So we didn't really have a great costume budget, but we just worked with a person who had access to like a wild amount of really costumey vintage clothing. And I bamboozled 3 painters into painting cloth backdrops to serve as sort of set. So we didn't have like a super elaborate set. It was just kind of like sort of proscenium. It was just sort of like a bunch of wires above the stage and then like a bunch of like wild abstract impressionistic like paintings that these people did for me. I do not, to this day, we all did this for like no money. I think the stipends ranged from like $100 to $150 for a 16 show run of this play, and we all just like worked our asses off. The actors had like an insane job. The prop designer made a cast mold of the actor playing Berlioz's face and made like a beheaded head for him. And I just basically quadruple cast him as every character that got their head cut off during the play and threw a couple extras in just to like really hammer the gag. And so it was just kind of like a lot of resourcefulness with like very little resources. And a lot of ambition, a kind of ambition that I think like maybe I only could have pulled off that kind of like, no, we can do this, everyone, at like 22 years old. Yeah. At an exceptionally articulate 22, I was like, no, this is fine. We'll just do it this way and this way. And like, obviously we didn't like, when Margarita is flying, we didn't have like a pulley system or anything. We just had like a few actors in like cute, flowy, windy, silver costumes, like pick her up. And I was like, oh, it's fine. You guys are the wind. You're just lifting her. And they're like, what are we here? And I was like, you're the wind. And they're like, okay, got it. Like, it was just like stuff like that where we're like, okay, how can we make this? And, you know, theater is kind of a magic trick in and of itself. And it's a play about magic. And so it's just a lot of projections and fake blood and a lot of nudity and a lot of trust. So it was cool. It was probably I would say the biggest scale project. Yeah.
All the good stuff.
I'm like, when is the next time I will bamboozle 20 people into making the most unhinged, crazy production? It's hard to get people into that.
the amount of times me and other actors have like gone to like the painter friends or artsy kids in a place and been like, no, could you just help us paint for like 1 hour after school or after the class, just for 1 hour? Like, you know, next thing you know, it's 3 a.m. and everyone's crying, they're so tired, but it's like, we only have till 9 in the morning. It's just, I don't know, we did you know, even in bands, right, like putting together, like before one show we decided we wanted a kissing booth to have in the club, in the nightclub, and then everyone in the band would take turns at it, and our fans could line up and do this old-fashioned sort of carnival style because we were that kind of dress-up band anyway. And you know, so we had to get a couple of friends to like make it all night the night before. Of course, you know, it's how these things work when you're young. You just throw everything on the wall and see what works.
Yeah.
Was it when you adapted Bulgakov, were you obviously the biggest challenge is just to try and get it on stage somehow, because there's
Mhm.
so much in all of those Russian novels.
Mhm.
Even like the reason every time I get through the first couple chapters and then put it down is because I realize I just don't have the overall mental space to really absorb this
Mhm.
book and all the layers and all the stuff that's going on in it. Because I, yeah, it's tricky. It's fun but tricky, right? And just remembering the characters. So you need to have some real time every day to get to work with it, to go through it. Were you looking to adapt of sort of a general sense of the whole novel, of the whole narrative, or was there a particular aspect of the story that you focused on, which is often the case when you have to do an adaptation, right? You can't hit all the points, so it's like, what are the points you're going to hit? Like, what was it that like for you? What did you want the audience to experience and walk away with?
Yeah, I definitely pared so much of it down, and it was still a little over 3 hours, but, yeah, I definitely
Right.
I think my 2 big, I would say, quote, or my I don't wanna say I won't give a number because 'cause I'll keep thinking of things, but I think the things that I focused on that were sort of my angles for the production storyline wise, I would say obviously the romance of the Master and Margarita is important, but that doesn't really even begin until well into the story. And so I think one of my angles, besides the fact that the Master and Margarita in this book were sort of a lesbian relationship, I mean, or at least they were played by two women, is that my way of getting that love story onto the stage early on was also to render Caesar and Jesus as the Master and Margarita, the same actors. And so, and it wasn't just like, oh, I have to double cast them. I was sure when I wrote the adaptation, like, oh, I know I'm going to have to do some double casting. And what I want to highlight is that the Pilate and Jesus story is also a kind of tragic love story. And so that was kind of one of the angles, like, that was one of the sort of plot through lines. So, in a way, God, I keep talking about reincarnation, but I sort of envisioned it in my head that, like, sort of this was the two of them in a past life. And then the other kind of angle of the story that I really focused on was the character of Bezdomny, who plays a really important role, I would say, in the beginning of the book, because he's kind of the eyes of the audience in a way, and he pretty immediately goes off the deep end, right? But I find his story really compelling, and it's one of those things that I think could really easily get lost in the narrative. And so I would say the Master and Margarita, who were also Pilate and Jesus, Bezdomny, and of course the devil were the four sort of leads in the play, and in a way the story focuses on kind of like their narrative. And of course, like, the devil's retinue plays a role throughout the story. I think I pared it down to Hela, the witch, um, Behemoth, Karavyev, and then everything else was kind of extra. And so those three actors appear throughout the story in some kind of, depending on the character, some aspect of their costuming or makeup that makes it clear that the whole time, even if they're playing like 10 other characters, they are still those demons, right? So, for instance, Hela, who is played by a dear friend of mine who I'm very grateful to for doing this for me, was pretty much naked the entire play. And she would take on other characters, but she would just put like one article of clothing on. And so the whole time it was clear that it's like, oh, there's this thing happening to these characters, but it's really one of the devil's demons, like, sort of stepping into this. And so that was kind of like a guiding principle for how I approached adapting it, was like, okay, these are actually the characters that we're really following the whole time. And they are sort of transforming in these different ways, but even when they're transforming, their sort of core character is maintained. And that wasn't, it didn't fit neatly into every lane in the story. There were other, actors who played different roles that, a couple of them just, like, they played like a lot of the small characters, and they had a lot of different character arcs and stuff like that. But I think I pared down a lot of it. There's this whole subplot with the theater company that stages the Devil's Magic show, and I just kind of cut all of that out. It was a bunch of characters and a bunch of different things happened to them, and it could just, in in true carnivalesque form, and the story like totally goes off the rails. And I just was like, I sort of like, I don't have time for that. These are the character arcs that are the most important. So that's kind of how I approached adapting it. I cut so much out. I mean, it's a Russian novel. You like can't adapt that into anything but a mini series without making some really significant cuts to the story. But like the spirit of it, I think I maintained kind of through those characters for the most part.
Well, I guess on the topic of adaptation, and again, yeah, we'll talk more about Master Margarita once give me to the end of the year to read it. Maybe I can get it done. And we'll talk about that again, because that would be fun for me. I'd really love to have someone to talk to about that book and have yeah. So, but on the topic of adaptation, what did you think then of the adaptation of American Gods?
I didn't get that far into it.
The series,
I think, yeah,
Yeah.
I was. It's not my favorite Neil Gaiman adaptation. I will say, the at least season 1 of the Sandman adaptation was like pretty pitch perfect to me. But yeah, I should consider giving it another chance. I think for me, it lost me at the Queen of Sheba scene, which in the book, it's like one of the most haunting book scenes to me, where she just sort of like consumes somebody by way of, you know, seducing him. And it was so cool, and the writing was so beautiful,
You
and
say cool,
like,
I say terrifying.
well, sure.
So.
I mean, I am the whore of Babylon, so I
Yeah.
really resonate with with entrapping men and gobbling them up in my pussy. No, I'm good. Oh my god, I'm not allowed to talk like that on
That's
this
fine.
podcast,
You're
am I?
allowed to say that. You can totally say that. You can totally say that.
Okay.
Uh,
But yeah, to me, like the writing of that scene was so elegant and so beautiful and interesting. And then in the adaptation, it's just kind of like lurid and cheesy, and the CGI is really bad. And I was like, I just can't get into it. And it's some of that, I think, just has to do with technology, right? Like, how do you, it's one of those scenes where it's like, how do you capture the sort of, I would say, like pretty poetic fluidity of the writing on the page, and how do you render that visually without it just like looking really silly and crazy? And so that didn't do it for me. That scene didn't do it for me. And for me, when it comes to book adaptations, if they fuck up my favorite part, I'm like out.
yeah. I mean, that's fair, right? I was surprised that I was able to enjoy it, but it was hard to, when I had to sort of force myself to, every time a new season came out, to watch it. And yeah, but if I could get into it if I watched many episodes all at once, which during COVID, early COVID, was fortunately easy to do, right? So it's like, okay, I guess I can finish those last 2 seasons of American Gods now. But I was surprised that it kept going when Sandman got canceled. I was very surprised, because I thought, I'm not a graphic novel fan of the Sandman. I just never was exposed to it. But I thought it was really interesting, and I would have liked to see more like that kind of, beautiful, imaginative reality we don't get to see done very well very often. And I know a lot of people said it wasn't as good as the graphic novel, but I don't know.
What do you want?
Graphic novel's on a piece of paper, and this is moving imagery, so to me it's kind of better.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty pitch perfect. I mean, I too am not like a big graphic novel person. I will admit I had an anime teen phase, so I read some manga when I was in high school. But other than that, I don't have a lot of exposure to like comic books and graphic novels. I was exposed to Sandman through a witch, actually, somebody that I'm working on a pretty intense ritual composition with right now that will present in about a week and a half. But she was the one, she's like the person that got me into tarot when I was really young and mentored me with that. And she was like, oh, you have to read the Sandman. And so I normally, especially in my adult life, and not that comics and graphic novels are less serious, but in my adult life, especially as like a publishing person, I think the time I would dedicate to a graphic novel, I'd rather dive into the oceans of literary stuff that I'm forever going to be behind on. But I did read the first volume of The Sandman, which I think was start to finish what that season of it was adapted from, and it was pretty perfect to me. I mean, not being an enormous graphic novel fan, I thought it actually in some ways kind of improved on some of the subject matter, which I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate in the comments for that. But I don't know. Excuse me. I think there are some things about Neil Gaiman's understanding of identity that haven't aged as well as others, and I think that the adaptation did a pretty good job of updating those things without really, insulting the spirit of the work or changing it too much.
Yeah, I've always known that I need to one day go through all the Sandman graphic novel thing. One day I'll grab a big, the big one, the big print that's up there. I'll see one someday at a place and buy it, go through it.
Yeah.
That's
what made it easy for me. It is beautiful, and someone was handing it to me to borrow for free, and I was like, it literally feels like my sorceress friend is handing me a mystical tome, and so I feel like I kind of have to make good on it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of mysticism and magic in the writing and in the story, from my understanding. I got to see Amanda fucking Palmer on stage here a while back, like 2 or 3 or 10 years ago. I'm not sure when. And it was like 3.5 hour long performance with her and all her friends and stuff. But at one point, Neil Gaiman came out and did a reading from Sandman of this word sparring, this battle of words that he has, that the character has in the story. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt came out to do it with him, and they did this battle of words on stage. And the weirdest thing was then Joseph Gordon-Levitt went and replaced the drummer for the next hour and a half and kicked ass. So I was like, this dude can drum, and it was a fun night. I got to have a nice chat with, Amanda and Neil, but she was pregnant, so they didn't stay out too late. Yeah, it was what sold me that the Sandman writing was as good as they said it was. I didn't realize that comic book writing had sort of gone to that level, but I wasn't that familiar with Neil Gaiman, so there you go. I was just through American Gods and through what was that thing he wrote for the BBC? People think it's a book, but it's actually a series. He wrote it as a series and then turned it into a book about people living underground in the subways and stuff.
Neverwhere.
And they can't be seen. I forget. Neverwhere. I really liked Neverwhere when I saw that in 2003. And then he based the book on the show, that's one of those other way around scenarios that people don't realize.
I didn't even know it was a show. I just read it.
Yeah, it's great. He wrote it. Yeah, he wrote it as a show. He wrote the show first, and then.
Have you seen Mirror Mask?
Yes. Oh my God, that's Neil Gaiman, isn't it?
That's a him. Yeah, that's a him thing.
Okay, I haven't watched it in my life. He was a part of my life a lot earlier than I would think when I remember, because I just wasn't associating it really with him until I got into American Gods, and we had to read Good Omens in my class in seminary during my master's on the Book of Revelation. So in our class on the Book of Revelation, Good Omens was one of the books in that course, along with textbooks on Greek and biblical study analyses and stuff. So it was a bit of contrast, a bit of pop culture contrast. That was fun.
I have to admit, I didn't make it through Good Omens.
Did you check out the show?
Yeah, I did. I watched both seasons of it. I thought the first one was good. But I don't know. I think it was just the wrong time in my life for it. I remember being really impressed with the passage about, the plague of pestilence. I'm miswording it, I think, but the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, where it's like this whole thing about like sucking all the nutrition out of food so that people are eating, but they're not actually nourishing themselves. I remember being very impressed by that passage, but I just kind of, it just was one of those books that it was one of the first books probably ever that I didn't finish, which is horrible to say because I love Neil Gaiman and I'm sure Terry Pratchett is great. I never read any of the Discworld books, but
Yeah,
I
me
just was
neither.
kind of like, I don't know. It wasn't for me at the time.
Yeah. Well, so how we've waited a while to talk about magic at all almost. So
I was
that's
just
kind of
thinking
cool.
that.
That's kind of cool. But you mentioned involving a ritual work you're working on, ceremony stuff. How does all of this artistry and creativity, how does that play out in your magical life? Are you I'll think about that. I'm forming that question. Go ahead.
Well, I'll say, and this is going to sound glib, but to me and for my philosophy, we've been talking about magic the whole time, which is a very glib
Right.
way of saying, for me, my first access point to magic, and obviously I have a personal spiritual practice and entities that I work with and traditions that I pull from and things like that. But to me, my first access point to magic was the philosophical belief and understanding that the artist inherently is a witch. I mean, I don't want to, if you're an artist out there and you don't like being called a witch, that's fine. You don't have to claim it. But to me, you're taking a set of materials that ostensibly have no relationship to each other. You're creating an image or you're enacting a series of prescribed actions, or in the case of improvisation, in the moment actions, and you're hoping to enact basically a spiritual or emotional effect on people. And that in turn is a hope of influencing the world around you. And to me, that is magic. I mean, obviously, I think it's easier for listeners to appreciate like a poetry is a spell because a lot of pop cultural renderings of ritual work feature like pretty simplistic poetic forms and things like that. But I really think all of it, it's the construction of like images and symbols that may or may not relate to each other outside of a particular context and putting them together and hoping to achieve an effect with them. And to me, like, that is ritual. And so my own body of work as an artist, I like to say, just sort of like honors the reality of what artistic practice is. But I come at it in different mediums from very different angles. So in my band, which you've listened to, it's more just like that's the most, I think, accessible form of how I am, shall we say, channeling, which is just that a lot of the things that I create, well, I don't, we create them together. I write the lyrics. A lot of the lyrics that I write and concepts come from divinations or dream visions or esoteric concepts that I'm working through at the time, or rituals. And again, it's like a more accessible form of it, especially in the first album. Like, I Send You a Ghost and Your Toenail a Spell are pretty like basic paint by numbers type of like ritual or ritual actions or spellcraft or incantatory stuff. So it's like pretty, like, oh, a song is a spell, right? But I have other projects. My solo project is I do a lot of like really clangy sort of Diamanda Galassi like covers. I write some songs, but when I play a full set of music as my solo act, there is an element of like ritual and storytelling and poetry. And like I will often, I'm not like pulling from a specific spiritual practice most of the time. But for instance, like for the winter solstice, I did a set that was a sort of participatory ritual unburdening where I came in dragging a huge bag of stones while I was singing unaccompanied and laying them around the theater in a circle. And these stones became sort of representative of burdens. And I talked between songs about like different kinds of burdens and then read different poems that were in some ways sort of like banishings or ritual catharses of these different kinds of burdens, and lit different candles that had different meanings. And when I do this for a general audience of not witch people, I talk them through what's happening and, light incense. And it's like, this is what this candle is for. And here is this poem. And so I come at it at a lot of different angles. I would say that the piece I referenced that I'm working on with a friend, this sorceress friend, who incidentally is the same person that lent me the Sandman and taught me tarot. We're doing sort of a ritual conjuring of Persephone, and we have a number of reasons for doing that in this context, in this city. The one that I feel comfortable naming on the air is that the Baltimore art scene historically has been very tolerant of abusive behavior and sexual predators, and perennially sort of like allows them, or the people who have protected them, continue to thrive in our scene. And we were asked to do a show initially without the knowledge that one such person was going to be involved in it. It felt a little bit too late to pull out of it. So we decided that what we would do was sort of a ritual around the rape of Persephone, and just sort of like conjure into the room what Baltimore continues to do, and what, in a way, sort of the old gods of Baltimore continue to do, which is like protect other old gods who have caused a lot of harm. And so a lot of the way that I interface with ritual and art is also like political in some ways. It isn't always, but in this case, the ritual we're working on is in a way also kind of a call out, and in a way also kind of a like calling in the big cosmic guns to help us with this problem that we have tried to influence in more direct ways in previous circumstances. But yeah, when I talk about the theater scene kind of falling apart here, a lot of it has to do with theater companies that were run by like abusive and predatory people who were called out and then like protected, and then a lot of their victims were like threatened and blackmailed and all of this kind of stuff. So this is like very dramatic. I mean, of course it's like classic art scene stuff, right? But yeah, so that's, and this friend and I sort of intersect on having left abusive relationships at the time that we reconnected. And so it's like a personal banishing as well. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm just trying to offer a range of ways that I approach like ritual and the incorporation of ritual magic into my artistic practice. Some of it is, I just believe artists are conjuring and channeling, and they should be responsible and intentional about how they're doing that and what they're doing and how they're protecting themselves and the people around them from what they're conjuring. And then it just sort of spirals into like, I often can't separate my ritual practice from my artistic practice, because so much of what goes into my art comes from divination and from the relationship that I have to the spirit, the spirit world, if you will. So that was a lot. That was a very loaded. This is a very loaded thing to drop at the end of that description of like, oh yeah, we're doing a ritual in response to like rape culture and abuse culture in our art scene. But it's that's
a good reason to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's I always say this, but yeah, magic is good for things that are hard to deal with in any other way. Yeah. And things like systemic corruption in governments, law enforcement, justice systems, all that stuff, very hard for us to have any impact on as a single. I mean, we can, and we shouldn't just give up and not try and make noise when we think we should make noise. As everyone's well aware, I made a lot of noise throughout the lockdowns because, I was one of the people really affected by it, and I don't feel bad about that at all. I think, if you don't like people making noise because about stuff that doesn't affect you, just don't listen, right? Because you're not affected. But to those who are affected, especially by things like, well, in the lockdowns is like losing your home and job, and you're not allowed to work, but somehow you're supposed to eat. Go figure that. Go figure. Tell me how that one works. Or if it's rape and sexual abuse, and and those are the things that rip my family apart completely. Yeah, it was like all we've been dealing with most of our lives is the fallout of those two things. My sister even worked in that field, and I can tell you, she was informed by the cops here once that they like, 'cause she advocated for the women she worked with at a transitional home.
Mhm.
And even if 14 different people had accused one guy of that, the cops said that's not nearly enough people to consider it at all credible or even investigate. And like they
Yeah.
just, yeah, it's like, it's really bad. So like, fucking A, use magic,
Yeah.
do ceremonies, do plays, you
Mhm.
know, psychodramas and mystical theater initiations. One of my favorite things about Waldorf school growing up was the mystical plays that Rudolf Steiner was such a fan of, that he built them into the Waldorf curriculum, so that you had to cycle through these 3 plays, and the devil in one play is the red devil, but in the other one he's as Lucifer, but in the other one he's Ahriman. So there's actually even a distinction between the 2 devils in 2 of the mystery plays that Waldorf students do. We learn that plays and psychodramas and mystical theater and magic are intimately connected, of course, when we actually start studying the history of magic and ritual and what it was
Right.
used for, whether in
Right.
mystery schools or in the early magical writings. You mentioned in your biography of course the Greco-Roman stuff, but also you mentioned work that you've done in the archaeological and primary sources of the Greco Egyptian and magical papyri and all these sort of traditions. What have you drawn most out of the magical tradition and the historical texts that has informed your practice as a witch?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to keep going back to it, but it really, as a primary source, I think Idol 2 by Theocritus is a huge, I mean, it is the locus point of me. Like, I was already thinking about art making in this way of like, oh, well, art is a spell and blah, blah, blah. And then I read this poem that is like sort of an unhinged monologue from the perspective of like a jilted witch, and I was like, oh yeah, this is really it. I mean, as far as the actual practices go, I think I draw a lot more philosophically from the spirit of alternative spiritual practices in a tradition or in pantheon that is already quite witchy in a lot of ways, because I think from an academic perspective or a historical perspective, I think a lot of what witchcraft was doing at the time for people, because there's a distinction between like witchcraft and the actual sanctioned sort of religious practices. And I think a lot of what witchcraft was doing, and I think a lot of why people even back then were very afraid of it, is sort of attacking the hierarchy of who gets to participate in religion and who religion benefits in this particular society. And I think that's so much of what witchcraft, the spirit of witchcraft, has always been, right? And so I mean, as far as like the concrete things that people were doing, I would say I have drawn more from the Greco-Roman pantheon than I have from the Greco-Roman witch traditions, because I'm not like rolling up lead curse tablets, or I don't do a lot of sympathetic magic, which obviously a lot of witch traditions have had, but Greco-Roman witch traditions have been really into. And, a lot of the sort of like filtras and things like that are certainly things that I would not necessarily recommend that people dive into. But I think for me, from a lot of my like just academic stuff with that, which has mostly been teaching and writing papers on it and stuff like that, um, has been kind of just like wrapping my head around the spirit of witchcraft as a sort of anarchist spiritual practice across different like times, and tracing sort of the image of the witch and prejudice against the image of the witch to a time period where like, hey, people were not believing in a single all-knowing God and having these prejudices, and it turns out they were still saying the same things about the same kinds of people. If you look at the history of when I teach a class on this, a research class on this, I have to always tell my students, no, you can't talk about early modern European witches. You can't talk about American colonial witches. You have to talk about just this time period and look at what was happening with just this time period. And they're like, oh, but they were persecuting women then too. And I'm like, yeah, exactly, right. And things like that. It was the people that were most maligned, even in Greco-Roman literature and also just society, for practicing these things, were women and foreigners, right? And in contemporary American media, we are still portraying monstrous witches as like American people, and or sorry, not a non-American people and foreigners, right? And like women. And so for me, a lot of my relationship to the Greco-Roman period when it comes to witchcraft is just like really tracing the ways that witches have been persecuted, and tracing the ways that the image of the witch has been persecuted outside of, say, like a patriarchal colonialist Christian lens. And again, I'm not saying the church, that's just exactly to say that the church isn't necessarily responsible for the persecution of witches across time. The church was taking cues from what was already happening in like a sort of pre-Christian Greco-Roman world, and who was being persecuted for basically claiming power, right? And so I think, yeah, I hate to put my, like, I know I'm putting my teacher hat on and like avoiding the question about my spiritual practices, but
No,
the
it's good.
truth is, like, archaeologically, there's very little from the Greco-Roman sort of witch traditions that I would do now. It's so based on like herbs that are very specific to time and place, and like cultural contexts that are very specific to time and place. But that spirit of like witchcraft and spirituality as something that pushes against hierarchy is really important to me. And this is a time period where we just have so much evidence of witchcraft being an act of will against the system in one way or another, and an act of like a way for people, for instance, of lower classes to try to insert some power or will over circumstances in which they feel powerless. And like you said, I think like witchcraft as a way of dealing with things that you don't have the power to deal with by ordinary means is like such a huge historical part of it. So I don't think that the rituals and practices of Greco-Roman times would work for me. I believe they worked for the people at the time because of the context that they were pushing against and the tools that they had. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I wanted to ask you that, and I'm glad you threw it back to your primary source of the what's it called?
Idol 2.
Yeah,
Theocritus.
well, because if it is as important as you already said it was, then it makes sense that you went back to it. It's just I can imagine there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be listening to Theocritus's Idol 2 after
Yeah,
this,
sorry.
and checking it. No, that's good. People should go check it out. If it had such a huge impact on you, and I've not heard of it, I'm sure I'll enjoy it. And it's interesting that ethos, I suppose, is what you're saying, rather than the details of it, the nitty gritty, is what has influenced you as a modern practitioner, as that is sort of fused with your contemporary horizons through the real life people who trained and taught you different things, and then how you express that through art and theater and acting. And I was really, when we got into talking about magic, I was thinking, oh God, but how are we going to get back to music from there? And instantly you started talking about music, and that was wonderful, because that is the answer for you, that your magic flows out through your music. And that was something hard that I actually had a harder time understanding about my journey when I went into music, especially at first part-time and then full-time, when I was able to, when it paid enough to do that. I struggled with understanding how that worked with my magic, and trying to incorporate different practices and approaches to the music. Right away, I knew, for example, I wasn't going to ever take some sort of mechanistic approach to crafting songs using notes because they correspond to this or that planet or Sephiroth or anything like that. I knew that wasn't like it for me, because that just didn't jive with my creativity and the way my creativity emerges. I knew that, but it could be, so I had to learn what sort of practices and techniques fit with it, and what didn't fit with the music. And your music I really like. I'm glad we get to talk about this now, because again, you have a beautiful voice. People watching and listening should know that you have a beautiful voice, and you have wonderful control of that voice, which is almost many times more important than having a good voice. We've all heard karaoke singers who can hit octaves that men shouldn't be able to hit, but they can't do it in time, and then the sustain falls off or something like that, and it's like, well, you gotta work on that. It doesn't matter if you can hit the note if you're like having to take such a deep breath and bend over so that you miss the beat. So that's not gonna, you got to work on that. You got to fix that. Otherwise, who cares what notes you can hit if you're hitting them at the wrong time? Yeah. So your voice is very Bowie-esque in the symphonic music of the band. Again, you have to remind me of the name. It's not Willa, that's the song.
Oh yeah, Moth Broth is the name of the band.
Moth Broth. It's such a good witchy name, right? It makes me want to like carve a pumpkin and put on a witch movie. I was gonna say Little Witches, but I don't know what that is. It's probably my childhood. I'm sure it's a show. I'm sure there's something.
It's Little Women, but for pagans.
Little Women. I mean, Little Women's kind of, yeah, it's kind of pagan-esque.
I think so too.
They were Universalists, isn't that what they were? That family, yeah. They were Universalists, I believe is the word, and they were humanists for sure, but they were a certain type and had a very alternative spiritual belief, which unfortunately didn't make it into the recent adaptation by what's her name. But yeah, Little Women's good story. So people should read that book. That's actually a good book. Yeah, it's actually a really good book.
Oh wait, I lost.
It's fun. So the music, yeah. So what's your most which song of the ones on that album, for example, because I listened to that a couple times, which song when you were making it felt most like a magical act, like a spell that was just like pulling the words and the music out of you because you connected to the right source or spirit, and it just like.
Yeah, so one thing that you said too that that made me laugh a little bit is that you don't compose music by these like sets of symbols, and we actually we don't like live and die by that, but we do certainly we utilize astrology and tarot a lot to talk about like what vibe we're trying to fulfill with a particular song and how we're ordering songs. So like
very cool.
Yeah, like Baba Yaga, Greg has a lot of feelings about the numbering of it on the album and the sort of like Scorpio consciousness of it. And I would say, I think the two that I mentioned to you when I was sending you some links and stuff, I would say Scry Baby was first a poem. It was one of my first published poems, actually, I think when I was like 22 or so. Thank you. I'm glad. That's our sleeper hit. Greg and Jason, if you're listening, this is Frater R.C.'s favorite song. They don't love performing it as much as I do.
You didn't mention that song as something I should listen to. I just, after listening to the full album and on the second listen, I was like, that was the song I really liked, and it was called Scry Baby, which is a great name, Scry Baby.
Thanks.
I can totally imagine people that I could have maybe referred to as Scry Babies. What would a Scry Baby be? What's a Scry Baby? What is a Scry Baby?
To me, well, you're talking to one. To me, a Scry Baby is somebody who engages in an act of divination and like allows it to rule their life and allows things to become. The Scry Baby, the song is about self-fulfilling prophecies, and I have, for me, like. This song is such a perennial question of my career as an artist, which is to say, like I find poetry writing and even to an extent fiction writing to be often unwittingly very divinatory for me, and not in ways that I think I'm creating self-fulfilling prophecies, like details in a poem that I will forget that I have written when I return to that poem years later. For instance, after something really bad has happened, I'm like, oh shit, I talked about this specific color and this specific circumstance and with this result years before this thing kind of came to pass. And sometimes these things will like come back into my life and I'm like, God, did I like conjure this awful situation into my life because of this poem that I wrote when I was like 23 or whatever? So excuse me. So to me, Scry Baby, it does contain the title of the album, Eye of Flying Crab, but it's kind of about yeah, seeing something during the act of, in that song Scrying, for me it's tarot, and allowing like the negative feelings that it invokes in you to sort of rule your life and perhaps like cause those things to happen for you, right? So in the song, I think broadly it's about seeing in, and this is a very classic scenario of self-fulfilling prophecy, but seeing in a scrying bowl that a relationship won't work out and then pushing the person away because you're so upset by what you see, right? For instance, so I would say, yeah, a scrybaby is someone who takes divination, takes the negative aspects of divination a little too seriously, or reads a little too much into those kinds of things, rather than saying, oh, this is something that has a really negative outcome. Maybe I'm being warned so I can subvert it, or at least prepare for it, right? So that one, as far as the writing process goes, I mean, a lot of the phrases that became that poem came to me in hypnagogia. So either while I was sleeping, I would wake up and write something down, or just as I was waking, a phrase would come to me, which is not as much a part of my process poetically now as it was when I was younger. I think I can access those parts of my brain and channeling when I'm awake a lot more than I could when I was younger. But yeah, Scrybaby came together first as a poem that was intensely divinatory, in the sense that it just like phrases came to me and came together. And then including the sort of tongue-in-cheek nature of like the goddess is telling you that you're overcooking your food, basically. But so that one for me on a mystical level came together really quickly. And then I will say, and it's kind of the most basic witch song of probably anything I will ever write, which is Your Toenail a Spell, in terms of it's like literally a description of, like the 5 points of the star in a ritual. It's like the most basic, if you could, witchcraft, not even Witchcraft 101, like remedial witchcraft. But I will say that when Greg and I wrote and recorded that song, the entire process of writing and recording that song, all of our technology was like crazy on the fritz in one inexplicable way or another. And it was the second song that we wrote together. I Send You a Ghost was the first. But between the writing of those two songs, we just like experienced a lot of like really inexplicable tech problems and like technical glitches. And we had to, I think, re-record. Well, Toenail, I re-recorded the vocal during COVID anyway, because I wasn't happy with the vocal that I did in 2016 or whatever. But all through the recording of that, we had to redo a bunch of stuff because it like wouldn't take, or like something was like picking up a signal from somewhere else. So like that one, in terms of conjuring, I mean, it was like we literally cast a circle when we were like working on that song. And again, it's like, I hate to even say that because it's sort of the least profound of our songs. It's just like a description of the most basic possible summoning ritual. But in a way, I guess you could say it kind of summoned what I believe will be a lifelong collaboration of like ritual magic through music. So maybe there's like something to that. I don't think Greg views our process in that way, but that's what I think we're doing.
Well, you're lucky to have that at all. I think it's really cool that you can work with a group of musicians who are into the magical side of it. That was my number one struggle throughout my over a decade as a full-time musician, was struggling with musicians. Obviously it's hard enough to get the ones who are good enough to pull it off. To keep a top-notch drum and bassist, you got to be playing a lot. But also, if you want them to be magical, I mean, these are probably guys who spent their life in jazz school, and now you're trying to get them to, put on a mask with sigils under it and say a prayer at a certain time. And like, they're just not having it. Like, it was all I could do to like get them to give me space, so that when I was sometimes recording in the sound booth, they might let me humor me they give me some time to do a little woo-woo stuff for myself. But I couldn't get much leeway. Thanks, guys. And I do blame the size of Canada, the small subculture. We have a great, healthy art scene. It was healthier prior to the Olympics, of course, but it still exists. But there's not a big enough subculture that there's a overlap with the magic and musical scene.
Yeah.
Well, there is. It's just like, what, two people? I mean, I know two magicians who are musicians in town, and we hang out, and there's some others, but there's not a dearth of people like there is in the States, I think. So that's making me nostalgic for the States again, man. You're making me wish I could go find a bunch of magical musicians to chart and plan their albums in a magical way. I want to hear more about that. That's what it's my whole rambles about, is wanting, when you guys planned and programmed the albums. I mean, that's very exciting to me. It makes me want to like just stop the interview and set up the recording stuff and get going. Actually, a friend sent me a track the other day that I have to lay down some stuff on, so that's fun. Yeah. How did you guys plan it with tarot cards and other things? Like, what was and here's the fun new Greek term for everyone. Everyone knows the words like cataphasis and apophasis, and you're throwing in what, ekphrastus?
Oh
Ekphrasis?
yeah, ekphrasis.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
ekphrasis, this is a technical Greek term for something very important and pivotal.
Yeah, so in terms of, I mean, we're not hard and fast about like um how to put it, like, we don't, if you were to ask us to break down the schema of what astrological sign each song kind of attaches to or whatever, like what tarot card, I don't think we would necessarily agree on what it is or what it means. But we do, like, as a thought exercise, a lot of times just utilize this language to try to draw stuff out of each other. So for instance, yesterday or Sunday night, Jason and Greg and I were getting together, and we're kind of we're really close to finishing our second album. We're working pretty furiously on it because a pretty big band called Shushu is remixing our most recent single, and so we just feel like we need to like sort of seize on the momentum of that kind of opportunity and like have this album ready to go ASAP. So we're like really, really close to finishing it. So we're kind of at that stage where early on you just get into a room and, for lack of a better term, just kind of vibe, or somebody brings something that they were working on already that they were like noodling on, and then we go from there. Usually it's Greg. Greg is kind of the musical mastermind for the most part of the band. But when, for instance, on Sunday, I don't think we got all the way through the list because we were like pretty stoned. But as we're working on this new song, we were just sort of like, well, what planet do we need to fulfill? We have like basically 2 spots left for songs that we haven't started writing yet. What planet do we need? What planet is missing? And so we were going through what songs we have already and associating them with each planet and kind of justifying our feelings about that. And we didn't make it to a comprehensive, completely agreed upon list of what all of them are, because we were like, oh, that one is Venus, and then someone's like, really, you think that one's Venus? I think this one could be Venus. And we're like, yeah, I guess that's true, but I also think this one is the sun, or like whatever, or Mercury or whatever, for this reason. So we kind of use that language a lot to communicate with each other. And if I'm trying to convey a lyrical idea to Greg or Jason, for instance, sometimes they'll be like, well, because I do all the lyrics, they'll be like, well, if you had to like attach a tarot card to what we've come up with already and what you're thinking about, like what card would it be and why? And so we use this language a lot, and occasionally we make decisions based on like where something will be slotted into an album. Baba Yaga is the one that keeps coming to mind because Greg was really insistent that it had to be the 8th song, and it has something to do with how Scorpio he feels about it. And I couldn't quite recreate for you what his reasoning was, because I don't necessarily see that as a Scorpio song. But I was like, if you have a strong feeling that this needs to be number 8, then your feeling is stronger than mine. So it's more like we sort of use this language to try to communicate what we have inside of us to each other conceptually. And then, of course, Greg and Jason let me get away with a lot just esoterically in the lyrics that I write. They provide a lot of feedback for me, and sometimes they're like, no, that is too much. Like, we have a song on this, on our upcoming album called familiar purr that's about like the summoning of a spirit into the body of a kitten. And originally there was like a couple lines of Latin from the Book of Oberon that scanned perfectly with the melody that we had agreed on. And I was like,
Wow,
we have to do this because it's perfect. And they were like,
that's super cool.
they were like, we can't do that because it's really alienating. Can you come up with something that scans that kind of conveys that? And I was like, sure. So, you know, they don't get let me get away with everything, but they let me get away
Right,
with quite a lot. I mean,
that's
we have
cool.
another song about the Christian mystics Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, who I'm obsessed with on a scholarly level. And I'm like, yeah, I my bandmates let me get away with like making this into a lesbian love ballad about these two medieval Christian mystics. So I'm very, very lucky to be working with two. I mean, both of I didn't go to music school. They both have at least one degree in music, and they're just both. In Greg's case, he's been really into astrology. He runs an oddity shop in Baltimore, and what I can
Cool.
say about Jason is that he was really influenced by Joanna Newsom when he was younger. So he somehow that the spirit of somebody making music that's fantastical, like still resonates with him because he's a very practically minded person. But he's like, yeah, I love Joanna Newsom. Whatever, let's do it. So I'm very,
I
very
don't know
lucky.
who that is actually.
I don't know that you would be into her. Uh,
I don't know. Yeah, I can't comment because I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I
She's
don't know
pretty
about
into
the
like
sign.
myth. I think she has an album called East. I mean, but
I'll
she's
take
kind
a
of like,
listen.
yeah, she's not on the streaming services, I don't think. So I haven't been
Yeah.
able to do much of a dive. I keep telling Jason's not like the type to make a mixtape, but I'm like, he's like, Jake, you have to get into Joanna Newsom, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. What you got to help me out here, man.
Is she like a Tori Amos, Lorena McKennitt kind of vibe?
I would say closer to Tori Amos than
Oh,
Lauren McKenna.
I like Lorena McKennitt, but I'm actually even a bigger Tori Amos fan.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
infamous Baltimore Peabody Conservatory dropout was Tori Amos. We claim her. We do claim Tori Amos because she spent 2 years at the Peabody Conservatory or
She's
whatever.
amazing. I wish I could have afforded it. She was just in town the other day. I couldn't afford to go see her. Like all the concerts are like $400 now. What
Uh-huh.
is going on? What the fuck, people? $500-600 still for shitty seats. It's crazy up here. Like it's all like the thing that makes me sad is because I can still save up and go to whatever show I want, obviously. But there's so many people I know, right? They're just not gonna even get exposed to this stuff, right? Like when you're young, when you can't afford it's it's hard to afford any show when you're young. You're certainly not going to be going to these expensive $500 shows and sitting in the nosebleeds for, and so I'm worried about the effect of it on, you know not just, yeah, on younger people, really. I mean, it sucks that poorer people can't afford to go, but it really sucks that young people growing up won't be able to go to these shows. um and I'm just it's sad. Anyway, I don't know how that's going to get fixed, but yeah, I mean, it's dark times for musicians, but also in a way the best time ever, because you can still literally just hit the jackpot with a single song and just
Yeah.
put it out there and wake up and your life has changed. You can, and the
Yeah.
fact that you can do that at all is crazy. It's crazy, right? All the medieval minstrels going from castle to castle, hopefully getting paid and not slayed, would have killed for this. They'd be like, "What? You can just sit at home and record any song you want, and all you need is one hit, and you're like rich as a king." It's like, yes, that's correct. Like, and yet you spend your time complaining online about the world, right?
Yeah.
That's what we do. That's what we do. We could be writing songs that could hit the jackpot and investing our time and hearts and souls in art, but yeah, a lot of us are You know, it's easy to bitch and moan about the opportunities we have as creatives these days. So
Yeah.
it's fun today to do a podcast talking about art and all this stuff. Thanks for letting me ramble a bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry I keep steering it away from esoteric stuff, but it's not because I'm
Oh,
not
that's fine.
a spiritual. I mean, like I could talk all day about like what's on my altar in the other room, but it just doesn't go in that direction.
Well, now you have to say something about your altar. What's on your altar in the other room, brother?
Okay, sure.
Oh, first someone said something that I thought was worth showing. Someone named after my favorite Welsh god, Lugh. Lugh. The frustration of trying to explain magic to someone already practicing it without knowing. Yes,
Absolutely.
That's an interesting one, you know, because I found that with musicians I would work with, especially ones who were like, they didn't know about that side of me. I really didn't, you know, they weren't actually that interested, but I would try to sometimes explain to other performers like energy work, you know, God forms, focusing on the spirit moving through you rather than like sort of projecting yourself out to the audience. I don't know if you ever noticed this. I guess it would depend on how much solo performance you did, but you probably have noticed this in the early days of being a performer and having, you know, being such an experienced magician. I was trying to project my energy at the audience all the time in the first several years. And I figured this out pretty quickly, but I was always trying to push my energy out to get their attention so that they would listen closer to the songs and not talk during them, right? Which is how you start out when you're playing those little cafe shows as a solo act and honing your craft, cutting your teeth. And it didn't work. I noticed the more I tried to emit and emote, the more the audience seemed to be pushed away. And eventually I just realized through trial and error and through practicing and eventually not giving a fuck that what the secret actually was to let the song and what I was doing suck me in. And then I would get sucked into myself with so much energy that I'd create a vacuum pulling everyone else in with me. And it was a breakthrough. It was the biggest breakthrough of my performance life up until I realized that all you have to do is just listen.
Yeah. I mean, I think
that's the final stage of breakthrough for every musician. You get told it all along, but one day you have that Gnostic understanding of what people mean when they say just listen. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I mean, I think before I had before I had text of my own that I was trying to put out there through music and performance and stuff like that, I have to say I might owe this in some ways to like theater training, but also definitely to religious music. So something I meant to say before is when we were talking about spirituality and music is, I mean, obviously you can tell I'm the type of person that believes like music is in some ways to me the purest form of spiritual channeling and spiritual expression. And I think, you know, for me growing up in the church, and also my first music gig was playing keys, quote unquote, for like a mega church rock band when I was 18. And and I have to say, the one thing that I can still, not the one thing, but a thing that I can still really agree with the church is that I grew up on is that like you are channeling God or some version of God when you're making music. And you are like, so I've always, what you're describing, I've sort of, before I was a musician and a performer, I've always felt that way about music, where it's just like I was brought up in a religious environment that taught you like basically singing along to these pretty generic contemporary Christian worship songs or whatever is like a way of channeling and calling in God. And so in a way, like I feel like even though what I'm doing is in the case of my solo act much darker, and in the case of Mothbroth, you know, witchier and perhaps more playful or whatever, like I've just always felt like I'm sort of channeling something. And I feel that way when I'm writing too. And not that none of it comes from me. I'm like actively making choices about words and phrasing, but like I don't think inspiration and ideas are things that come from inside of us. I think that's like would be extremely well, I don't want to insult anyone's beliefs about where their ideas come from, but I will just say, for me, I don't think any of my ideas come from inside of me. I think they come from other places, and you're given the task as an artist to refine them, right? But I think in performance, I think maybe because I was always first performing other people's like words, and then in theater performing other people's text, where you're like a conduit for the playwright's ideas. I think the easiest part of performing music for me was like, yeah, just like being taken over by whatever it is. The easiest and sometimes the most irresponsible, when I was less responsible about the kind of music that I was performing and the kind of ritual that I was doing. It's like the flip side of that is like you can kind of let things in and then ultimately out of you that are like maybe things you should, maybe things that don't need to be put out there or projected onto people, or given to people who haven't asked for it. So I don't know. I totally agree with you. I think good performance and good music is totally channeling what you're doing and not trying necessarily to control it. You're controlling what you have control over, which is like your body and your face and how you sing and the chords and stuff. But I don't know. I've never been that precise of a technical musician either. So at least with piano. But it's not about that. It's about the channeling, I think, for me.
I mean, who needs music school when your drum and bass player can go to music school? So
pretty much. That's
yeah,
pretty
right?
much my.
It's
I
like,
mean, yeah.
you got to work with people who have the skills you don't have.
Yeah,
And
totally.
that's obviously part of the secret to the creative life. Yeah. So what is on your altar?
Okay, let's see. Right now, Skachach, I've been working with the Celtic warrior goddess. Scylla is a huge part of, and also Scylla is now tattooed on my body. The monster, the nymph turned monster from Greek mythology. She's like less of a goddess and more, I mean, nymphs or demigoddesses or whatever, but she's like a protector spirit. Skachach is as well. The Norns are on there right now. Baba Yaga, obviously, some deceased people in my family. There's a part of my seasonal altar that's for Bridget, which I don't do. I mean, I do like all the seasonal and cross quarter rituals, but I don't always do the worshiping of the associated deity. Like, no offense, I'm not like when I celebrate Beltane, it's not about Bel for me. It's about fairies and, the fairy queens and stuff like that. You know what I mean? It's just like,
Oh, I know.
I don't always I don't always go straight into like, oh yes, but Bridget I'm obsessed with because she's like, to me, the icon of pagan and Christian syncreticity of like,
Yeah.
she was a goddess of dawn and fire, and now she is a real human woman who was a saint that is for some reason associated with fire, and we can't like totally trace why this has happened, except that I think people were not willing to give up worshiping Bridget or naming her something different. Well, depending on where they were, or Freyed if you were Welsh, but except that, like, yeah, I don't think people were willing to give her up or change anything about her. And they were like, okay, we'll like maybe create or find a real person that resonates with some of like the archetypal characteristics. I don't know. I don't mean to project that onto people who have feelings about Saint Bridget, but that's how I relate to her historically. Yeah, it's all, I guess it's all women. I mean, I had John the Conqueror on there for a while. I work with Hermes sometimes. The only saint I work with, unless you count Bridget, is Cayetano. I have a lot of weird feelings about like saint stuff, just because of how I grew up. Like, I don't really tap into that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I'm working with right now, specifically, at least that I can name with human
Yeah.
speech.
Yeah. And you even pronounce Skahath the right way. For folks listening, what you want to visualize is Skathach. That's how you'll see it written, as Skathach. But T's and H's serve an interesting role in modern Irish, replacing the old diacritical shevu, which softened the consonant to a h aspiration. Yes, it's very odd. And it's extra confusing because even if you're in Ireland speaking Irish, you'll see Irish people ignore it in certain circumstances. Like if there's an S with an H after it, they'll still say sh, even though it should be h. And you'll be like, hey, shouldn't that be h instead of sh? They're like, yeah, but when there's an S, it's just nice to say the sh. So yeah, skaha, or skaha, skahu. In some places you'll see them do an oo for all the vowels at the end. It's weird. Yeah, that's such. I've never heard of anyone. No one's ever thrown that name at me before as something they're working with. So that's very exciting, very cool. And when I in my last year in Ireland, I was in Belfast and wrote a whole fairy folk musical, all with traditional Celtic instruments. We spent years recording those songs as demos to see how it worked. Threw those out because that was just the first string of demos, and even though they were it was good, it just no. And then a couple of years later, reworked the whole thing with some theater friends of mine here, and we wrote the book for it. And that meant I had to change some songs, and it's been in development for fucking forever. It's been one day I'll finish it. Maybe it's been 15 years of development, but we'll see. It takes a lot of people to put together an actual musical, even just to put together a workshop of it. As you know, even if you're in a musical, if theater town in the film industry with tons of contacts, like in favors you could call, and it's still crazy amount of work. But I do want to do it before I die, is put on my fairy folk musical. And who knows, maybe we'll get to collab someday on fairy music or performances in the future. I have other friends who've worked on musicals here in town, like Dante Inferno type stuff that they'd love to do at Freemason halls and things like that. So I think there's a lot of exciting musical magical projects coming down the pipes from the current generation. Everyone who's gotten into magic in the last 5 or 10 or 20 years and are becoming artists and musicians and creative types. And we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that spirituality portrayed, in art throughout the rest of our lives, which is something I'm definitely here for.
I hope so. I don't know what kind of spiritual things the kids are in touch with. I mean, I did teach this Greco-Roman witchcraft research class for a few years, and I did have people come out of the class telling me that they got really into tarot or really into other aspects of mystical spirituality, and I was like, don't tell your family that this is what inspired you to do this, or I will get fired. But yeah, I'm less in touch with what they're doing because I feel like I teach college age students, and I don't want them to think I'm proselytizing the gospel of the witch to them. But I am in really underhanded ways. I really am.
Well, teaching by example is the best way to teach, right? So yeah, let's see what the future holds. What's the kind of track listing and what instrument do you play? Because their stage performances look really cool. They're the kind of thing we would go for whenever we would do like steampunkish dress ups on stage or fairy folk sort of costumings for folk festivals and things. What's the next sort of so that means I'm very excited to see the music video you put out for this remix. Like the music videos where you have a chance to have some real fun creatively, so I can't wait. That'll be super fun to talk about next time, along with Master and the Margarita and all that. What's the theme of the new album, if there is a theme, or what's the aesthetic journey you're sort of looking at?
I will let's see. I don't want to say the working title on the air because I think my bandmates will get it's not set in stone. But currently I think we're working a lot with different kinds of duality, and I think we're looking at a title schema that is like side A is called this and side B is called this. I think that the line that we're most interested in deriving sort of the thematic through line from is from the lesbian Christian mystic ballad, love ballad, which is the line is "We who dream the fall," and it's about there's a lot of I think there's a lot of stuff in it about different kinds of coming out of isolation and different kinds of experience of apocalypse or collapse, like personal or societal. And so not all of it is like that. I think some of it is still very playful and and fun and effervescent, but there's a lot of, I would say, I like to say, if our first album was a fantasy, this one is like magic realism. So it's like kind of engaging more directly with I think what a lot of us have been experiencing, but through kind of a societal lens. So yeah, so I think something about right now, we're most excited about um something derived from the line "We who dream the fall." I think that's all I'm allowed to say about the title without my bandmates getting mad, because it might change. But we have sort of a duality version of that, because something we're playing with in this album is also having songs that are companions to each other on side A and side B. And they're not always narratively, like there are two songs that are like, this is this a side version of this, and then this is that story from the perspective of a different character. But otherwise, there are songs that kind of reference each other in a kind of like dualistic way. So I think like stuff about rising and falling we're thinking about a lot, and apocalyptic stuff. Yeah. But
Fun.
yes, thematically, yeah, I know, really. Thematically, there is I think a lot about like longing and loneliness and isolation, and like ways of breaking that, or ways that that's been imposed on you, and ways that you're like kind of pushing back against that or calling things in. Willa, the song that I sent you, that we've actually released, is the first song that we all wrote together when we could really like be in the same room making music and doing shows again. And it kind of is a song about coming out of isolation and feeling like you're too weird and feral to interact with people, and then kind of realizing that everybody else is weird and feral too, and it's kind of fine. So there's like a lot of stuff, there's a lot of stuff in there about that, because Julian of Norwich, the Christian mystic, also lived in isolation. I mean, she like lived inside of, she was an anchoress, so she lived inside of like a tiny cell inside of a wall, and she was like only allowed to talk to people to give them spiritual advice and share her dream visions from God with them and stuff. So there's like a lot of stuff in there, yeah, about that, and about different times, because she was living during the time of the bubonic plague, and so there's something in there about well, that song's not really about that, but it's, yeah, there are different things about like people trying to make the most of isolation or collapse. This is cheery stuff, but it is cheery. A lot
A
of it is very
bubonic
cheery.
love song
Yeah.
in three parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yes, Julian of Norwich was all the rage when I was in seminary 25 years ago, 20 years ago. And yeah, she was very popular at the time. She probably still is, but it definitely seemed like there was a resurgence of her popularity going on. It's very tied into the whole centering prayer movement, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, which
I
is like resurgence in Christian meditation, of course.
Yeah, I am obsessed with her. I mean, if I had to pick between the two, I was more of a Marjorie Kemp girl. Although, I mean, you want to talk about a scry baby? Marjorie Kemp's whole thing was going around and having visions and then just like crying hysterically about them. I'm like, I actually really relate to that. She was really into be like going into the town square and just like crying at how sinful everybody is, because God is showing her how disgusting the world is. And I'm like, honestly, I kind of relate to that. But according to her autobiography, she and Julian really hit it off. I read both of them in grad school in a seminar on dream visions,
Oh,
and
that's
became
awesome.
really obsessed with both of them. And they have a really interesting duality too. I mean, Julian obviously doesn't talk about her in the showings because she doesn't talk about anyone that she met, but Marjorie talks about having like a really lovely conversation with her, and they're so diametrically opposed in this way of like Marjorie kind of found a way as a peasant woman to like travel alone, which was pretty radical, and then Julian, I have a lot of interest in did a lot of research at the time in just the ways that their spiritual practices and beliefs and behaviors like interfaced with gender in a really interesting way. And their encounters, both of them had encounters with the devil that, or demons that did not involve them getting like raped or possessed, which was really unusual for women at the time. It was like, men had like temptations by the devil, and women were like, assaulted or had their bodies taken over by the devil, and the two of them had like a traditional sort of masculine temptation by the devil. And I'm like really, really interested in the two of them. And then of course there's Julian's like mother Jesus sucking at his breast, like kind of philosophy that I don't know, I'm really into it. I will find the queer subtext anywhere if you give me enough time.
Well, yeah, it's we created very fertile grounds by marginalizing the history of human sexuality, right?
Uh-huh.
For the current scenario, and there's good sides to that, and then there's the dark sides of that, like Kinsey, and
Uh-huh.
which I thought that was all like chill, legit stuff until a girlfriend of mine was like, you should check out this documentary. Actually, I was like, I've seen the
Uh-huh.
movie with Liam Neeson. She's like, yeah, you really need to check out this documentary. I was like, oh my god, oh my god. It was like, yeah, and I'm convinced now that Hollywood film about Kinsey was fully paid for by the CIA or the Kinsey Institute, because it's such bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, but the repression of that, I find this very interesting when I listen to academic lectures looking at the history of magic these days, especially. And I was attending lectures even 20 years ago from archaeologists from Duke University who were, doing their tours of their recent findings and looking at how in ancient Jewish settlements the women's jewelry was kept separate from the women's magical tools. And this was seen in every single hut in the village. So all women in like this example of an ancient Israel settlement had a separate compartment in the ground. This is just a hole in the ground that they would have covered, right? There's shelves and drawers and such. Had a different compartment for their magical tools, which is fascinating. I mean, you're never going to see that mentioned in any history textbook. You might now, but it takes a long time for these things to get into the survey courses, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
just finding facts like that, just the fact, why was that fact repressed why wasn't that mentioned in Jewish culture or any of the history of Jewish culture?
Yeah.
You don't hear about it we didn't hear about when we studied the Hebrews in high school or college or any time. I never heard about, and the women, when the husbands came home from doing their rabbinic thing, would practice magic for the household and do spells for their kids and their husband. You never heard any professor in high school say that, or teacher say that about Jewish culture, but because of the repression of the different gender roles and even sexuality of people throughout history, we now have all these really good questions that actually can get some answers to them that really flesh out what ancient history was,
Yeah.
beyond just the History Channel's version of it, which is
I
so
mean,
reliable.
I, for one, make no distinction between my jewelry or my magical tools. I feel like for me, they're one and the same, so I don't need a separate compartment for them. Although, I mean, in present day, I do think half the reason to carry a purse is to be able to carry amethyst around with you, or whatever you need, whatever crystal you need. So I don't know.
Sure.
There is something to there is something to these. I don't know, the use of like sort of traditional women's tools as also like hidden compartments for spiritual objects in the present day, or for magical objects. I definitely hide magical objects in my purse.
Yeah, that's I think that's a good idea. I recently went through my sister's purse and found all the talismans I've given her over the last many
Wow.
years in different pockets, and she had
Wow.
hidden them in different inside pockets of her. There's just a little Pinocchio one I made for her. And And yet the ancient Jewish witches separated their jewelry from their magical implements, which I just is delightful, a delightful fact to find out. And I'm so excited to hear, like, you know, all the stuff that's been going on in the universities and archaeology departments. I look forward to that information slowly continuing to roll out to us outside of the systems, because, you know, if you can't access the journals, it's hard to get the information.
Yeah.
Yeah, knowledge is expensive, more expensive than ever in some ways these days.
Yeah, we got to crack it open. That's like one of the only things keeping me in academia is that I'm like, I have access to the library databases, and whenever I leave an institution, I'm like, do you need any like contract work? And I'm like, secretly, it's because I'm downloading all of the PDFs that I can of esoteric texts if I can find them. Especially research universities, man, they've got the good stuff.
Yeah. Yep. I don't know what to say to people who say that information and education should be free, because it's like, I mean, it would be nice if everything was free, but I just don't know how we're going to get there. Like, I don't see that happening in our world.
Yeah,
you know,
certainly not the way it's set up.
We could definitely make universities cheaper, but yeah. But it just, I don't think it'll work to ever have people expect teachers to teach for free.
Right.
Or, you know, and the sad to see that teachers are seen as one of the, not only have, like nurses, have they been some of the most underpaid professionals in our society, but now you hear the teachers, like there's teachers just not teaching, right? Like, you know, the average grade 7 student now is reading at a grade 2 level.
Yeah.
Because they're not being taught. And so that's really sad.
I agree.
Yeah. I just don't know what to do about it, man.
Yeah.
Don't know what to do.
For me, the answer was leave the teaching track in higher education and teach people in other arenas of my life. I mean, I teach one course a year still because I developed the curriculum for the course. And I would be happy to teach more if they could like make it into a sustainable living for me. But there is no, especially at the higher ed level, there's like no desire to let people make okay money from teaching. Yeah, no, I mean, I was teaching college writing for 7 years until, another time and another day, we'll talk about when I did my tarot wheel of the year, and the part of the year where I pulled the Tower and the 3 of Swords and the Hanged Man is like was also the end of my Saturn return and like the time where my academic career and a lot of other parts of my life fell apart, which was a little over a year ago, which you know, it made way for a lot of things that are actually better and healthier for me, as the Tower often does. But yeah, the part of my grand ego death Tower moment of my life was like the reality of, you know, it really doesn't matter how much I've accomplished. I either have to get a PhD in a field that is probably going to be dead in the next 7 years, or by the time I finish my PhD, or I have to do something else. I mean, that's kind of the reality of it. This was all shaking out when AI stuff was shaking out too. I was like, there's not going to be as much of, there's already institutions trying to persuade us that there's not much of a need for arts and humanities teachers. What do they think is going to happen when you can get an AI to do it for you? And of course, like, the point of a writing class is not to learn how to write necessarily. It's like to learn how to think and problem solve and research and communicate and think about your audience and all of this kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm 100% with you about how teachers are treated, and there's not the solution is that the field is going to completely fall apart, and then we're going to have to figure out another way to revive it, I think. Yikes! That's not a hex. That's just
no. Well, I think there's opportunities in it, right? And I think this will play out probably after our lifetimes. But we'll see it's starting to play out, right? Like, the universities don't need to teach all the things that they teach, right? They
Yeah.
don't need to do all the vocational schools can be increasingly become separate.
Mhm.
Does creative writing need to be an academic skill
Right.
that's taught, right? Maybe not. Maybe it does. Let's not think about that one too much, because I love creative writing and I'll come to its defense. But there's other disciplines that could be sort of done a different way. Sometimes I think that we just need to eradicate all of the undergrad, just eradicate the undergrad whole process. It's just filler as far as I can tell at this point. It's great if you want to learn the thing you're learning, but you're required to learn all these things you don't want to learn.
Yeah.
So maybe it would make more sense to give someone like a general year or a preparatory year for a master's, and just then throw them into the master's.
Yeah.
And then if they want to then go do other tracks, right? So you'll get to that level faster. Which, if you do want to just keep learning, you can then go do something else, right? If you want to, really do chemistry, you could do your 1 year of chemistry, in which you do all the chemistry necessary that you would have done over 4 years, while also having to do geometry and creative writing for some reason. And then just go into that more quickly. And then you can just do more tracks if you want, without all the fluff and filler. That's what I keep going back to. And smarter people than us will hopefully figure this out, or not. And we won't be here, so who cares? We got ours. Haha.
It's a house of cards. I mean, I don't mean to haha it. It's still my field.
No, of course not.
And
it's depressing as fuck.
Yeah, but hopefully not. I mean, hopefully not for long. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. No, I mean, I think that the idea of general education theoretically makes sense. Like at the higher ed level, I think the implementation of it is very bad, and I think what is focused on is very bad. Like I appreciate the idea that in your first year of something like an undergraduate degree, you should be required to take a range of classes in a range of different disciplines to help determine what you want to do with your life. Also, is that a decision that should be happening while you're going into an insane amount of debt? Probably not. Also, does it really work that way for most introductory STEM field classes? Not really. If you want to major in STEM, you have to start in your first semester. You don't have time to figure it out. And the introductory STEM classes are not going to get you excited about doing STEM. They're going to make you feel like an idiot and weed you out if you don't have what it takes to to do what the institution thinks that you should be doing or should be able to do. I should not. I should stop because I still work in this field. Yeah. I'm not saying anything that could get me in trouble, but if I talk too long about it, I will.
Only if Elon Musk retweets you.
Oh God!
Like that secret scholar guy. That poor dude. He became famous overnight and then got fired.
Yeah, please, God, do not let please, Goddess, do not let Elon Musk notice anything that I'm saying.
Yeah, we're probably good.
You never know. You never know.
That's actually the scary thing about him. You can never know what he's gonna
do. Just a gram and a half of psychedelics and scrolling through esoteric YouTube. You never know. He could be riding the airwaves right into what we're doing right now. He's I don't know. I don't want that. That's also not a hex that's not a spell. I don't want that to happen, but
okay, since you mentioned hexes a couple times, before we end this, I'll grill you on your thoughts on hexes, black and evil magic. My grammar there is very intentional. As long as you know where the comma is.
Yes. Okay, so I in general do not support the practice of magic that imposes one's will over another person without consent. I think it's funny. I mean, I think what we traditionally think of as black magic or bad magic or whatever is like a curse where something bad happens to someone. I think like a love spell, for instance, is just as ethically dubious. For me, in my own practice, the only magic that I engage in that enacts my will over another person's generally has to do with binding and banishing, and it is never in a way that is intended to cause harm against another person, and it is only if the protective magic that I'm doing is not achieving the effect. Like there's only so much shielding around yourself you can do when somebody really has it out for you and is can affect other areas of your life that will affect you that you don't have control over, especially when it comes to other people. So I do engage in a down home binding or banishing spell here and there as a last resort, and I do not condemn it. And in fact, I highly recommend. I find it very effective and very helpful. But yeah, I mean, I also subscribe to the principle in general that like anything you do to another person magically, you have to accept the consequence that you might be doing it to yourself as well. I don't know that it works one to one like that, but like if I want to completely banish someone from being able to or my life at all, I do feel like I have to give up every channel of my life, or I have to be willing to let the magic cause me to lose whatever possible connections to that person that I have. And some of those connections might be with people or institutions or places that I still want. So I don't know. I think it all, like what you do magically comes back around to you. And like, I think that's a good way to work with this kind of stuff. And I think before you do anything involving hexing or cursing to another person, I think you should practice empathy and imagine if somebody had done something like that to you, would it make the situation better, and would it as a punishment be effective? So I definitely don't believe in magic as punishment, right? Like I don't think, oh, something bad happens to someone and it's going to make them think twice about fucking with a witch again. Although I will say that there was a person that I had at one point been connected to, that I had at one point done just some light protective magic around, and they continued to try to get at me, and they did get into a car accident. So I don't know. They were not injured, but I think I also don't think they thought twice about fucking with me, but it did happen.
Yeah. I mean, I hear a lot of these sort of I do hear a lot of these sort of stories, and that's why it's an interesting question for me to ask. I really, it was one of my favorite things to get into with Storm Fairy Wolf, who I'm a big fan of his books, and the ones I've read, obviously, which is not all of them. He's very prolific. That whole crew is very prolific. Those fellows. But the it's just hexing, magic on others. It's always going to be an interesting one for me, especially out of the Golden Dawn tradition where we have such strong vows against it, but and yet we also still have such strong protection magic and rebound type spells and rituals that exist as well. So for anyone who's stuck around to the end of the podcast, do you have any tips or tricks you want to share for those who might need to banish, bind, or hex those doing evil to them?
Oh yeah.
Any witchy
Okay.
tips?
Oh,
Witchy tips and tricks?
Where do I start? I never do the same thing. I never do the same thing. It always depends on the circumstance and the context. Obviously, if you can, and be careful if you're engaging in this. Obviously, if you can utilize something in your banishing that comes directly from the body of the other person and contains their DNA, that's like usually the most powerful thing. But I do find it quite powerful I'm just talking about objects to start with, like what you have at your disposal. If you have access, if you have or had access to a hairbrush before they fucked you over, or something, or they jerked off on you and you have some left over of that. Sorry, this is very prurient, but relevant to my life. So
thousands of people will listen to this, so it's going to be relevant to other people as well, inevitably.
So
not everyone.
The as they call it in the Greek, the ousia, right? The essence of the other person. If you need something, that's the most powerful thing. But also, if you have a photograph of the two of you, or something that person gave you that is imbued in some way with their spirit, or something that belonged to them. And then as far as binding goes, It just, again, it depends on what you have. I mean, I love, this was Greco-Roman, and probably they stole it from the Egyptians. But writing a person's name over and over, and each time you write it, you remove a letter from it. It's the abracadabra, the classic thing. But like that goes really far back. That was okay. You asked me this before. That is a Greco-Roman witchcraft practice that I have utilized specifically, that I got from, a source book. So that's something.
And it
I
works.
It works. It works for me. I like dragon's blood for burning if you need an herb. There are lots of herbs that you can burn. I really like dragon's blood. I'm sorry to the dragons, but it's great.
Particularly, you're saying in this kind of magical act, dragon's blood is good.
Yes. Yeah. Specifically. And then a modern witch tip, I like to use the freezer. So something that I'm engaged with as we speak, actually, I would say I love to start something with the new moon and imbue it, and then go full tilt boogie on the full moon. And so right now I have an active, I shouldn't be saying this on the air, an active banishing ritual. Again, absolute last resort, but the things that I have are in the freezer right now, and when I think of it, or when I have other candles lit, on top of the freezer I burn a stick of dragon's blood, and then at the full moon I'll like burn it all up, basically. But also honey, I do think, for banishing and binding, I think the use of honey is really valuable, because it suggests like that whatever happens, you can symbolically imbue it with some sweetness or some softness, right? So like if I'm banishing people and I want to signify to whoever or whatever I'm petitioning to, or just to the universe, or to whatever it is that's in my head at the time, depending on how deep into a text I am. Yeah, I think the use of honey to ensure that the effects of the banishing are smoothed over can be really valuable. Some people are really hardcore, like cow tongue kind of shit. That's not for me. But yeah, I don't, because if I do this kind of stuff, I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to hurt a person. I'm just trying to make it so that they can't hurt me. So I do, if you're worried about this sort of tangible effects on the other person, I think honey could be a really good way to soften that. So those are some things. Again, that's just to start. I have, rituals and things, but I also write, a lot of times I write my own text. I don't say like, oh, this person's like pull from this text or whatever. I usually, whatever the words and things are, I write it myself. But even if you're a fan of the craft, the like, I bind you from harming yourself and harming others, or whatever, like anything like that. Yeah, I don't know. Those are some of my tips. I do a different thing every time. It just depends on what I have. Burying stuff. I think burying stuff is really nice, can be really nice. If it's biodegradable, throwing stuff into a river as a cleansing, that's helpful. Yeah, those are some thoughts. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think those are great tips, witchy tips and tricks for people. Absolutely. The honey thing's very interesting. I am a big fan of beeswax. I've been doing that as a hobby for a while now. I started working with beeswax as a hobby during lockdowns, because I had a bunch. I have a ton of beeswax, really nice stuff, and just getting into making balms and salves and that. So to hear honey as part of that was interesting, and it made me think that's a good idea, because especially if you're doing magic to protect yourself from an evil person, you don't really want to hurt them in a way that's going to make them just be more evil and angry to other people and going on, right? Far better to try and hope and pray that they come face to face and have some kind of internal experience of the pain they cause others, forcing them to reflect on that, and maybe spend their lives looking in the mirror instead of spewing destruction around them. One can hope.
That is a really good point about it. Is that's a big driving factor of it for me, is like, if you make things worse for a vengeful or evil person, even if there's no physical way that they could connect it to you, it's when bad things happen to bad people, they're bad to other people. When good things happen to them, they can be bad to other people too, but that's not your business.
I could see someone thinking it would make more sense to start a magic like that on the new moon and then crescendo
Mhm.
or on the full moon and then crescendo at the
Mhm.
new moon.
Mhm.
Why
Yeah,
would
totally.
you? Yeah. What's the thinking around this for those who? What's your thinking on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I come at it two ways because for me it's happening the whole moon cycle for me. And so like the way that I come at a lot of this stuff is, I mean, obviously if you need like a quick and dirty binding, doing something as the moon begins to wane and the symbolism of the waning moon sort of stripping them of their power over you and so forth is a part of it. For me, the ritual continues at that point, right? It's like this is the peak of the ritual, and then as the moon wanes, that's when the power is really being drained. Sorry, I answered that question backwards. For me, when I have the wherewithal, I just consider the new moon the beginning of the cycle. And so I like to plant a seed. I like to think of it as like you plant a seed at the new moon and it comes to fruition at the full moon. But I have actually heard, and I have with quick and dirty banishings, I have specifically waited until like the moon is waning to do it. But I think in the case that like, if I want something to be extra powerful, I feel like I like to plant it at the new moon, and the power of the ritual grows and grows at the full moon, and then the ritual sort of like explodes it, and then the waning moon is like draining whatever it is of its last hold over you, or draining this cycle of its hold over you as it kind of renews. But yeah, so I see the wisdom of it. I just got really into the habit of not starting stuff on a full moon. Or at least
Well,
if I'm doing something, yeah, on a full
yeah, I
moon,
don't think many people start stuff on full moon.
yeah.
Sometimes actually, though, I have started tinctures on a full moon.
Mm,
Done like for the ritual aspect of it, and
mhm,
back in the old days. So that's an exception to that. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. It's cool to hear your thoughts on that, and I like how you mentioned like if you were doing it with full preparations and planning and you had lots of time, you could do it a bunch of different ways. But if you had less time and less preparation,
mhm.
the magical timing becomes more important, right? You're
Yeah,
implying that the new moon's more important if it's a quick and dirty one, as you say.
right.
So it's of course always never strange to see that confirmed across magical traditions, that what practitioners do.
Yeah, I think it depends on, yeah, do you envision this as something happening? I envision, and maybe this is the Cancerian in me, but like I envision when I can any work that I do, just like the whole moon cycle in a way is the ritual, and I'm adding to it or subtracting from it over the whole moon cycle. But yeah, if you're like I need this done and I need it done pretty much now. Yeah, there are I never get into the stuff that's like, oh, I'll do this on a waxing moon or I'll do it on a waning moon, because for me I'm like I'm doing it the whole moon.
We
But
do that as performers, right? With our performances,
yes.
you visualize your set
Hmm.
before you go on stage. You visualize the play and your parts and all of that. That's such a parallel between the magic and the music and art there.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It's all a play, right? Or the play is all a ritual.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's no surprise so many magicians are musicians
Hmm.
and performers of
Hmm.
different types. A lot of musicians, of course, and it's makes sense if there's a lot of magicians who are like, yeah, taking up music, which is a good thing. Music and language is the only way to really raise your IQ. Music and languages, I believe. That's it. I think that's the only two ways we've just figured out to actually get smarter substantially. So cool. Good. Anything that justifies me wasting more of my time on my violin.
Uh-huh. Oh my God. My new toy that I'm excited about that I'm gonna order. I just sold one of my old synthesizers that I haven't used in a while so that I can buy a Moog Theremin, and that's gonna be my
You're
new
doing it.
thing.
You're going full theremin.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna be
Fuck
that
yeah.
girl. It's not.
Fuck yeah.
It's like a theremin. I'm not quite a theremin for children. It's definitely a paint by numbers theremin. Like it has a built-in, like you can. It has like a pitch quantizer and It has a visual, basically a built-in tuner so that you can see what the notes and the semitones are, and it has some built-in voices and stuff. So it's a little bit of a, like, if you want to play the theremin for a cool show, but you don't have years to become a concert thereminist, it's a sort of a party trick theremin, but I think can still accomplish quite a bit. So I'm very, very excited about it. It's going to become my whole personality, I think.
Yeah, it's awesome. Again, it's used. I've seen it used at live shows by a couple bands, but notably one of my favorites, the Tea Party in Canada, has used it to very good effects on stage. So you can probably find a few YouTube videos of the Tea Party singer using a theremin to create a breakdown that leads to a different kind of climax, you could say. Right? Yeah. So if you're going to break it down, you may as well go all the way down to the theremin level, and then you just go into outer space. And,
I mean, we are societally in a little bit of a tower moment right now, so I think that's an appropriate metaphor.
Oh my God, we're like man in the high tower kind of moment. Yeah, it's gonna be a shit show for the rest of our lives, I think, and hey, what else can we say? We'll just keep making some music, and yeah, we'll have to maybe send some tracks back and forth at some point. Who knows? There's definitely
I'm into it.
There's definitely some apocalyptic fun to be had as the world deteriorates at present, and yeah,
I have people around me with good apocalypse skills. I feel like
that's good.
I'm not one of them. Well, sailing, that's my apocalypse skill. Formerly very good at sailing. And I'm good at soothing people, which I think is a very important apocalypse skill. But meanwhile, the last book recommendation I'll make today is Station 11, which for someone that was experiencing especially a lot of climate apocalypse anxiety, not that it's about climate apocalypse specifically, Station 11 kind of made me feel okay about the apocalypse.
That's good to know. It's how you learn to stop worrying and love the environment.
Yeah.
As opposed to the bomb.
Or stop worrying and love the frack. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
That's not on brand for me. I do a lot of like
it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. I mean, yeah. We could get into that, but yeah. So, well, shout out more everything we've talked about to people where they can check you out. Obviously, stuff will be posted in the links. I don't know what else we can talk about, but I'm definitely want to talk to you again after I've read The Master and the Margarita. Finished reading it, because again, I restarted every time thinking, no, this time I'll just spend a few days and really enjoy it, and then I don't.
You really do have to immerse, but I want you to read it because I want to talk about it again.
Yes. So we'll do we'll do an episode on that, with spoilers, so everyone else has time to read the book too. If you want to read the book and then jump in the chat with us and shoot off weird questions, we'll do a full Master and the Margarita, and you can go listen to the Tea Party song, The Master and the Margarita, and tell me what you think. And maybe you can send me the script to your adaptation, and I can have a look at it once I've done reading the book, because that would be fun.
Ooh,
that would be really cool.
Got to dig it up. I've got to dig it up out of the archives.
That seems like something you should. I guess you can't publish it, can you?
Right. It's kind of. It was kind of like not entirely legal that I used the translation that I used, but I was like, well, what are you going to do? Sue us for the tens of dollars of profit that we make over this theater production that's completely in the red? Like, please,
that's something AI could actually fix for you, though.
What do you mean?
That would be a good use of AI to go through your adaptation and create an original translation based off the Russian original, and then you could publish it. See, like, AI is not totally stupid. It is definitely stupid, but not totally. And that's one of the, that would be what I'd consider a good use of AI. Yeah.
I've gotta think about that. Well, yeah, I'll try to find it. That's like maybe 3 hard drives ago. But I bet it's somewhere. I
I
bet it's
totally know what you mean.
it's surely in an email somewhere from 2016 to the cast. I am sure that I said this is the final version of the script. So I'm sure
Yeah.
it's in my Gmail, in the annals of my Gmail somewhere.
And it's just a thought that could be it'd be cool to have it out there for people to be able to put on,
Oh,
right?
I
And
wish.
for some, yeah, of course. Oh my God, if my friends, my acting friends in town knew you were sitting on that, they'd be like, yeah, you got a copy. Like, they're always looking for stuff to do. And one of my buddies just put on Hamlet because he was bored. So during lockdown, he quit drinking and memorized Hamlet and then staged Hamlet right at the end of it.
Whoa.
I found out afterwards. I was like, dude, I would have brought people. He's like, oh,
That's also very Station 11. Oh, to answer your question about shout out things, the easiest place to find my work is on Instagram at DreamBabyJake, and my band is on Instagram at Mothbroth Band. And then from there, all the links to all of the things. If you're interested in Tea Leaves Queer Magic Realist Short Story Collection, if you're in Canada, it's probably not at a bookstore near you, but you can probably ask. I love to tell people, if you're interested in it, ask a local small bookstore to order it, so that they get the money for it. And then usually when you do that, they order a couple extra copies, and then some random person off the street might buy it for their kid and then call me a groomer on Reddit. So please, maybe not in Canada. No, that
that's
hasn't
the way to
happened
do
yet.
it.
That hasn't happened yet.
Wait,
It's a
what
book
hasn't
for
happened
grown-ups.
yet?
Oh, no one's tried to call me a groomer. I mean, it's a book for grown-ups. So like, I'm not, I'm
Yeah.
very, whenever parents, like whenever people with teenage queer kids come to my events and they're like, I would like to buy this, can you sign it for my child? And I'm like, as long as you promise they will not read it until they're 18, because it is very not PG-13. It's not like erotica or anything, but there's like gay sex in it, and that's scary to people. Not everything. A lot of it is not about sex, but enough of it is that someone with a Christian parent would hate me if their child found it.
Yeah. It's it's adult literature, which is good. It's fine. I mean, I don't even want to touch on any of the things you just referenced. All that stuff. I mean, we got other people. That's other people are sorting that out, figuring it out. If I was in the schools, if I was getting, I'm not getting paid enough to worry about that shit. That's the truth. If I had some job, then I might actually but it's just not worth the heat. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't have kids too, right? So, I mean, Jesus, look at me squirming. I mean, it's tricky up here in Canada. We're trying to pass a bill that's gonna get life imprisonment for hate speech, including anything you've said in the past or things you might say in the future.
Interesting.
So you'll be able to go to jail for life in prison if you are considered to possibly say something hateful in the future, or if you ever did in the past. And I'm from a different generation than young people these days. So we said a lot of inappropriate things. You can watch me on YouTube as Big Daddy and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1999. Oh, but you can't because of the words I'm saying. So it got deleted, right? A lot of the stuff. It's like, oh, well, yeah. So what do you want to do about that? That sucks that you can't go see me perform on stage on YouTube because those words are now not okay. So Tennessee Williams is now banned. It's like, okay, well, good. I don't know. What do you make of that? Like, I find it really disgusting that we're just banning all great writers.
We're having a pretty well, I was going on tour for this book when there was like a wave of book bannings or attempted book bannings and bills to empower book bannings specifically of queer authors, which was really interesting. The first 2 weeks of my tour were through the Bible Belt, which actually was great. Actually, nothing bad happened. to me at least, or to anyone at my events, but I was really nervous about it because people were like, like rioting outside of bookstores if there was a drag related event. Like it was like it's scary in a really different way. Censorship is scary here in a very, very different way, and in a way that like was like kind of literally felt life threatening for me when I was traveling. So yeah, censorship, I'm not into it. I'm into being critical of what we teach people in schools. But unfortunately, in the US at least, the people that make the most latitude of censorship and concerns around censorship are people that think that I should be dead.
Yeah, it's
Woo!
unfortunate. Yeah.
Or not dead, or imprisoned, or forced to like live a celibate life or whatever. Which
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
live in Baltimore,
Lovely.
so I basically am. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. Let he who is without sin get the first chemical castration. Hey, baby, you're sinless. Okay. Yeah. It's crazy. I'm very obviously pro free speech and all that. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, and then schools should be careful about what they show kids. I mean, and that's from either showing them too much information or not enough. Like when I reflect on my sex ed, it was like the teacher said some fucked up shit, and this person had no expertise. It was just a bitter middle-aged divorcee when she was just clearly upset and angry at life. And it was very obvious from the way she talked about sex. And, it was very much like, make sure you don't fall in love with someone and settle down, because that's the worst thing you could do.
Oh my
You're going
god.
to set yourself up for like the most miserable life where you won't even know the pleasures you're missing. This is grade 9, eh? And
Love
she,
it.
like, so like, which is, I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm in love with someone in grade 9, and I'm sure other kids are in love with people too. You're often in love with a different person every few months at that age sometimes, right? I know from like grade 3 on, I had a different crush on a different girl every week, and that's how kids are. It's fucking hilarious. But like, I remember thinking by grade 9, like, I really am in love with this person. If they wanted to be with me too, why you're telling me I shouldn't be with them or even try, and I should go have as much sex as possible? I could tell it was wrong. I didn't know how or why, because I was so inexperienced. And yeah, it was just brutal. So like, you can give people too much info. You can also just give them shitty info. And,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And people are always like, oh, it should be up to the parents, right? That's the conservative line usually, right? But it's like, come on, have you met average parents? Like, especially if you've worked as a teacher like we have, like, sorry, parents are not necessarily equipped to educate everyone, their kids on everything. So you have to have a safety net for that shit.
Yeah.
Like, you just have to.
I am a
It's
child
tricky.
of conservative homeschooling, and I'm here to say, you want to talk about
It's got some
grooming.
flaws.
It didn't work on me, most importantly. But also, when I went to a Baptist school, and we didn't have sex ed, we did have puberty education, and then a lengthy few weeks talking about STDs and how if you have sex, especially gay sex, people out there are going to purposely give you HIV and you're going to die. That was like the closest thing to sex ed I had, was like, don't have sex with anyone who's had sex before, because they have HIV and they want to give it to you because they are possessed by demons. It's crazy.
I get it. The sex ed I was talking about happened in 1995, right? That sex ed class was 95. So that was like, we were the high school generation that were like, don't have sex. Like, we were the sexless generation.
Same.
People did still have sex, of course. But it was not rampant like it was not long thereafter. It was crazy before and it was crazy after, but in those years for us, it was pretty, it was dare. It was the dare era. Like, is your brain on drugs, and, all that stuff, all the crazy wildness of the 90s, and the fear mongering. Like, it was the AIDS epidemic. I mean, it was that was what's so crazy about it. It was the same dude. It was Dr. Fauci in the 90s going on the news and telling us that gay people were hiding needles in cinema theater chairs to give AIDS to normal people. Right? That dude, man. That
Yeah.
guy.
That's me. What I have always to say about that, and the like, oh, people are going to give your children cocaine for Halloween, is like, man, who has that kind of money to be just throwing drugs around like that? Like,
Are they like, is that like, are they going to Charlie Sheen's house?
yeah. And
Like,
would they like to talk to me? No, I'm just kidding. I don't I don't
when
get
have you
involved.
ever met someone who's ever given away cocaine?
Right, exactly. They're all looking for their next bump, man. They're not giving it to you.
No way. But that is messed up if someone's giving drugs to kids. It never even occurred to me that that would happen. It shows you what a sheltered young man I am.
I don't think it's really happening. I think
Good, yeah.
it's conservative parents trying to get people to stop letting their kids go trick-or-treating.
Trick-or-treating?
That's
Oh
what
God, it's more of
that's
that
been
stuff.
the whole
Yeah,
there's
that
all
sucks.
the like, yeah, all that kind of stuff. That's for years. Now they're obsessed with it's fentanyl, but then there was a year where it's like, oh, they're putting crack cocaine and this, that, and the other, and it's like, it's fine. You don't like Halloween, that's fine. You go, girl. Do your like harvest day or whatever your church calls it. I mean, not that all churches are like this. I didn't go to, I mean, my parents were not. My parents are Christian and they weren't like that. But anyway, it came back to spirituality somehow.
We made it. We made it all the way through that. I don't know how did we actually have, I can't believe we actually managed to have a conversation on these issues that I'm actually kind of okay with. We thought we did a pretty good job because it's just too much. It just leads from one rabbit hole to the next. But it's I'm glad your book tour went well and you did well even in the more conservative areas where, you might have been judged. I mean, like,
people ride hard for it out there, like the people that are into it are really like Birmingham was really into it. And I was like, what are all these queer witches doing out here? And they're like, it's a queer witchy thing. And there's more of that going on here than you would expect. And I was like, all right, you got it going on this specific 10-mile radius of Alabama. Like, you're doing great.
You can always, and especially you got the Bill Hicks response. If anyone gets in your face, like, hey man, we're Christians and we don't like what you're saying here. So forgive me. Yeah, so good. Well, yeah. We're almost near actually the 3-hour mark. Let's blow through the 3-hour mark, folks. All right, let's do it. Because we're at 2:45. We may as well hit that magical 3.
I can't believe I've gone this long without peeing. I'm like,
it's amazing. It's amazing. Actually, do you want a quick little pee break? Because I have an intermission. I'll play
I do actually.
While we go pee.
If we're going all the way to 3, let's do it.
Yeah, that's only another 15 minutes. So
let's
see if this works. I think this should work. Okay, yeah, you can. Here you go.
Join us in person or online for Canada's only occult conference. Visit Vancouver in beautiful British Columbia and help us leave lockdowns behind us and get back to life. The first of 4 Dee and Kelly conferences over the next 4 years support the Arcane Research Society in bringing excellence in academic scholarship and practical knowledge from some of the best scholars and occultists in the field. Featuring in 2024 this summer, Dr. Terry Burns, translator of Dr. John Dee's famous Monas Hieroglyphica. Dr. Burns has just completed a 52-video course on this mystical text, which you can watch on YouTube for free. Join us and experts Rufus Opus, P.D. Newman, J. Allen Moore, Daniel Rekshan, Frater R.C., and more for this exciting event which will explore the angelic and spirit-filled world of Elizabethan mages, Dr. John Dee and the alchemist Sir Edward Kelly. Learn the secrets of drawing spirits into crystals, conjuration, and Enochian angel magic, as well as the role of dreams and their connections to these other extra-dimensional realities and alchemical transformation. Sign up today to attend online or in person at enochiacon.com, presented by the Arcane Research Society.
We're back. Can you hear me?
I surely can, and I managed to fish the last beer out of my refrigerator, and it's called Divine, and someone brought it over. I didn't plan this, so.
Divine indeed. That is divine. Yeah, well, the first annual conference of the Arcane Research Society, EnokiaCon, this year, I have to announce will be only online this year. We didn't get enough people to sign up to make it in person, unfortunately, but it will be in person next year, and it will be online this year. So go sign up today, people. And we've added a retreat happening right after the conference from the Tuesday to the Friday. Details are on the website for those interested in a magical 3-day, 3-night camping retreat with myself and some other fabulous magicians, adepts, and even a ghost hunter who's been on the podcast is coming. So there's people are coming to Vancouver anyway. So we're doing a retreat as part of that whole package. So yeah, there we go. There's a few words about that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with my work or if the podcast in general or what I'm up to, but yeah, you got a little glimpse of it there while you eat your popcorn. All right, so let's talk for another 11 minutes so we can hit that 3-hour thing and do ourselves proud. Yeah, is there any questions from people? Let's see. I mean, one of the great things about chatting with you today is like you've done so much. There's just tons to dig into and that we could explore. And so yeah, we'll definitely have to do another one when I finally make it through Mr. Bulgakov's fabulous book, The Master and the Margarita. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So what's your do you have many thoughts on the magical journey for new practitioners? Because again, the most common questions are how people engage with their magical path and training in the early stages. Once people get on a roll, of course, they sort of seem to do fairly well, since these traditions are often very well tread terrain, and there's a lot of pathways people can pursue. But what's your advice? What's your advice for the young witches and wizards out there in the world?
I think I was about to say at the risk of sounding woo-woo, and then I remembered that I'm on a witch podcast, and so I don't think that's as big of a concern. At the risk of sounding, yeah, at the risk of sounding Californian, shall we say, I think
I love that.
for me, spirituality is one of those things, like alternative spirituality is one of those things where and not to bring it back to like my book and like ways of seeing, but I really do think that once you open yourself up to wanting to understand it and wanting to engage with it and seeking it out, I think you're going to find what you need in that pursuit. Obviously do so carefully, obviously seeking guidance of people who are wiser and more experienced than you is a good practice. It's also good to be discerning about where their power is coming from and how they're using it, and understanding, that, like, I hate to say this, but like when I was young, I mean, any young person in any spiritual tradition or faith can very easily be taken advantage of by spiritual authorities or people claiming to be spiritual authorities. So that's something to watch out for. I'm like such an anarchist. I'm like, first, be careful of people who are claiming to have authority because they might be misusing it. But truly, I think that's something I wish somebody would have told me both as a young artist and as a young witch is not everybody that sounds smart and not everybody that sounds smart and like they know what they're talking about and like they want to help you is necessarily engaging with you through pure intentions. So just be discerning, listen to your intuition and your gut about people. That's a big thing. But I do think beyond that, I think really once you open yourself up to that way of seeing and that way of thinking and that way of seeking, I have to say it's like, just open your hands and it comes to you, right? Just start asking questions and you'll start finding answers. And again, the writing teacher and research teacher in me is like, be discerning about where you're getting your information from and what the stakes of the person giving you that information are, and use your judgment there. But for me, it simply took starting to think of myself as a witch and wanting to learn more about it to realize not only had I already been learning about it all of my life, and did I already have kind of a jumping off point, which if you're here and asking that question, you probably do too. You probably have a lot of knowledge and things that have filtered through to you, that you can already start with. And then I think, I don't know, I'm a spiritual anarchist in the sense that, like, I wouldn't recommend one practice or tradition over another. I think it has to come very individually with what your own values, and ethics and interests are. So just like, I hate to bring it back around to the Californian thing, not to be like, just vibe it out, but just open yourself up to it, with a sense of discernment, and seek it, and you're going to find it. And if something that you experience is not resonating with you spiritually, there's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're not a real witch. It just means that that particular way of seeing isn't for you and isn't how you're going to access that, for yourself. So I think it's a lot of listening to what's around you, listening to the world around you, paying attention to the hidden world around you, but also like listening to what's inside and what your inner voice is telling you about what you're experiencing. So that's to say that, like, I have some esoteric texts on my shelf that I pull from, but I also have a whole shelf of my shelf is organized with a very chaotic and very Jake-centric, like, brain way. But there is a whole shelf of texts that are explicitly esoteric, and then for me, right under that, or right by that, I can't tell. There's a whole shelf of fiction and poetry that is also, to me, religious text, right? So for me, I have come to a lot of how I view the world and spirituality, first through art and fiction or fairy tale or storytelling, and then eventually through grounding practices and frameworks. So, it's all real. It's like, it's all real and none of it is real. You know what I mean? We're like literally inventing reality, man. I haven't even had any pot and I'm like, we're inventing reality, man. But it's true. So yeah, I mean, the cool thing about being a witch is that you literally get to shape your spiritual reality and allow it to reflect your beliefs and interests. And anybody who tells you otherwise, well, they might have an ulterior motive. I'm not going to say they're full of shit, but they might have an ulterior motive. I don't know. I hope I didn't say anything offensive in there.
I thought that was lovely. I thought it was a lovely way. What are some of those fiction books you would consider religious texts for yourself personally?
Oh my God. Speaking of cancel culture and censorship, I must admit that The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, who it turns out was married to a horrible child molester and like kind of like was horrible to his victims, to me is kind of a spiritual text. That's an example of something we were talking about earlier where I'm like, I have very conflicted feelings about the spiritual meaning of this text to me, but like, it was my first access point to really understanding a version of reincarnation that I really resonate with. And that opened up a lot of doors for me. Obviously, American Gods is one of them. The Golden Ass, to an extent, but that's more of a philosophical justification for my like religious obsession with the idea that like actually speculative storytelling is the most valid storytelling way before psychological realism, because the Golden Ass was what we know of as the first Western picaresque. So yeah, some stuff like that. The Bacchae of Euripides is in there for sure. I mean, that literally is a spiritual text. I mean, the whole tradition of playwriting was in some ways spiritual. So those are some examples. But yeah, my God, The Mists of Avalon, I love it so much.
was a big part of my childhood.
Yeah. I hope I didn't just ruin your child. I don't know if you knew that. I hope I didn't just ruin
I
your
didn't know
childhood.
that. That is shocking and sad to hear that. If that's the case, I just found that out a while back about the Conjuring couple. The Conjuring couple. Like,
Oh,
he had an
shit.
underage girl upstairs that lived with him that he was sleeping with, and she sort of facilitated that. And the whole ghost hunting thing was sort of a big smokescreen.
Mhm.
They didn't even spend time usually with the haunted families. They just came in there, got their pics, and then effed off, and then told their stories. And so I watched the interviews with like the people that they had supposedly helped, and they're just like they don't line up with anything at all, which is a shame because I kind of like the series of movies. They're fun. Some of them are better than others, but like like ghosts and exorcism and all that stuff. So it's sad to hear about all these fucking pedophiles, man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
sucks.
again, like watch out for people claiming to be spiritual authorities, because most of them are great, but some of them might be using that as a smokescreen for something else. Most of them are not. Absolutely, most of them are not. But the Arthurian traditions have so much of an influence on me that my kitten is named Nimue.
Wonderful, yeah. And and I don't, as I do struggle sometimes with artists who are messed up, but as I asked a girlfriend once what she thought of like these artists that we like and listen to being like some of them being pedophiles. Her response was, "Oh, all the artists I like are pedophiles." I was like, "Oh, Jesus Christ. Like, you're not selecting for that, obviously, but really?" And she's like, "Oh, yeah, I think like all of them are gross people, but it's like, I'm not going to not like the art that I like, And
Yeah.
I haven't watched a Woody Allen movie since I watched the documentary, which kills me because I love the films. I love the movie. I grew up on it. But it's like after that documentary, it just feels weird. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one, man. Weird topic to end a podcast on, but
I know.
but where else would you put this in a podcast? It just naturally happened after the 3-hour marker at the 3-hour mark, and it is a hot topic, and we've talked about it. I'm glad that we talked about all these issues, which would be considered, I guess some of them would be considered culture war, cancel culture issues. But we talked about, I think, in an interesting and different way that actually genuinely comes out of both of our contexts. So that's better than a lot of the yelling and shouting we see going on online.
Yeah.
Are unfortunate enough to pay attention to it.
I mean, like, unfortunately, I think a lot of what is conflated as cancel culture is just like people expressing criticism of media is like, that's not cancel culture to me. You know what I mean? Like,
it's like when people say I got canceled again.
And it's like, oh, how many millions of dollars did you make from your comedy special about being canceled?
Yeah, well, everyone knows that with them. If you've got a special coming out, who did that right off the bat in their new special? Matt Rife, right off the bat tells him a misogynistic joke, which is not even a good joke. It was just like it's actually he redid an old classic, right? Like, the old, what do you tell a woman with two black eyes? Little bit, right? Like we've been hearing that since grade school. That's not new. So he actually recycled and dressed an old classic, tells it right away so that people who don't watch his special hear about it, cancel him, and he makes headlines and sells it $1 million. It's the system's so clear cut. It's like, yeah.
I've been joking with my one straight guy friend from grad school. Not my one, but my one that I'm close to. That
I don't mind how many you have as long as you number.
Yeah. I've been joking with him that once he's ready to start pitching his book, we can work on his PR canceling campaign. And I'm like, we can think of something for you to say where like the people who love you will still stand by you, but people will be offended enough. Like, I was like, this could be if this is your shot, I'll help you get just canceled enough to get really famous for your book.
You need to say something, right? You got to say something that makes headlines, but doesn't get you killed.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
metaphorically or literally, like crushed. You
Right.
don't want to be actually destroyed. I mean, yeah, but yeah, that's a funny one, man. I mean, the kinds of tricks you can pull with marketing, of course, online are only going to get crazier and crazier as time goes on. Like, oh yay, deepfakes! What a wonderful world we live in! Yay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited. Like, one thing I found out, like Spotify a while back sent out a company they work with sent out info to us. So like, theoretically, we'll get to the point where people listening to this podcast are all hearing a different podcast with the AI changing what we're saying to suit what they want to hear. And so what's that? I don't even know what that would be called anymore, because we are not necessary. It's more just like, put in our names, take our biometrics, create avatars of us, and then they say what every individual listener more or less wants to hear to maximize viewers, to maximize money, and that's it. And like that will happen, they said, if things go well, because they were proud of this. They were announcing this as a positive feature that's coming down the pipe one day. And I was just like disgusted. I tried to do a whole like outrage thing on it, but no one cared. Like, no one cared. And I was like, do you not hear what I'm saying? Like, yeah, we hear. Just so it's like, okay. The people who care are going to die out, and it's going to be a different future than we can imagine, and so be it.
That makes me really freaked out. New anxiety unlocked every time I do a podcast interview. I'm going to be like, well, what would an AI take from this and then regurgitate as my like podcasting brand? Oh God, that really freaks me out. So early in the emergence of like publicly accessible AI text generators, and this ended up being a failed experiment, I'm happy to say, but Jason was like, well, what if we generated text from this AI generator using something Jake has already written, and use that text to try to compose a song? And actually, we are keeping the composition that came out of it and probably turning it into something that I've like written completely new lyrics to. But it really freaked me out to like copy and paste something and be like, continue this. And then it's like, oh, that's what you think of my voice. And I know it was like lacking in sophistication enough at the time that like I was pasting in a particularly minimalist piece, and it was probably like linking it to all my least favorite like minimalist, like, you know, Hemingway and Updike and whatever, like American American fiction short story writers, or like I was like, oh, you really think I sound like that? That was like my first feeling, was like, oh, that's the pedigree of writers that you think I'm drawing inspiration from? Oh God. And then it quickly got, the AI quickly, and this happened especially in early AI, the AI quickly got pretty misogynistic. There wasn't even a gender of anyone referenced in the piece that I had put into it, and then it pretty quickly started referencing a woman, and then the descriptions of the woman got increasingly like very 1950s John Updike-y, like, I don't know. And I was just like, oh, this is really dark. And this was like early on, and we kind of sat on it. And then the next time we got together, I was like, this was an interesting experiment, and I don't ever want to do this again. Can we? It was an interesting idea, but I don't want a machine to tell me what it thinks I sound like. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I keep telling you that.
It's
as
the journey. No,
it.
it's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, we're just gonna have to be creative as we can with this stuff as long as we can. And,
yeah,
you know, maybe we'll be replaced one day, but not today. You know, the apocalypse will be fun, even if our world does crumble and collapse. As my friends always remind me, it's going to be a good show, and just sit back and enjoy it. And I take a different view than a lot of my friends, and I think we can still make substantial good, do substantial good. What's that?
Popcorn. It's my bag of popcorn.
I think we can do substantial good. And a lot of them don't believe that. And so I'm a little less doomer than they are. But we can definitely, I mean, hey, it's entertaining, sort of. The world's entertaining since the shows are becoming less entertaining for some reason. I saw that. What they've done to Lord of the Rings, man.
Oh,
we should
man.
get into it, but like that, like, yeah, that's just like, okay, you destroyed Star Wars, you destroyed all these other things, and now you've, like, yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, whatever. I even tried to watch some of the Bible shows, because
the Bible shows,
like Disney's biggest show is the life of Jesus. Like,
what?
Yeah, that's ironic as hell, right? Their biggest show on their streaming service is the new Jesus shows they put out from Angel Studios or whatever. I tried to watch them, but like, they're just actually not well done. If you know the Bible, they needed better biblical scholars. I hate it when they do the Bible. When you're going to do a Bible stories, like, you got to bring some quality scholarship into it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just it feels just like it's proselytizing. I don't find biblical stories interpreted for the sake of proselytization interesting. I find them interesting if they're trying to interpret the Bible in ways that actually bring out a stronger understanding of the meaning for that time and place.
Yeah, you gotta have better scholarship, and you have to have Mariah Carey write a hit song about miracles. That's the formula, right?
Is that in there?
In The Prince of Egypt.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. You're talking about the old cartoon too, right?
Have you ever seen it, The Prince of Egypt, the cartoon with There Can Be Miracles? That was Mariah Carey, right?
I'm sure I saw it probably in the theater. Like, I went to see Anastasia in the theater on my own on a cheap night when I was young, because I liked the Disney animation and stuff back in the store, and they were good shows back then.
I definitely saw Prince of Egypt in the theaters, 100%.
Yeah, that was great. Good stuff. All right, Jacob, this has been such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. We had so much fun. There's one final question coming in at the very last minute from Kisa. Thank you for the question, Kisa. Kisa asks, is there any folklore on nosebleeds? I get them before full moons and near timeline shifts on my life. Interesting question. That's for you, Jacob.
I have a thought about bleeding around the full moon, which is not an answer to your question. And as I'm answering this, my cat is like jumping on my table, being like, "You gotta stop." So bleeding around the full moon. If you've been listening to my prurience, I think you know what I'm about to say, but maybe not. Which is, did you know that humans and possums are the only species that menstruate around approximately a monthly cycle? And so bleeding around the full moon, from a spiritual perspective, for me, feels very natural. I won't get into the reasons why, but there are things that happen to my body that often cause me to bleed around a full moon. And I just consider it that there is, for me, something that I need to be making a sacrifice for, or something that like, for me, around a full moon, if I bleed, I never bleed. First of all, I do not encourage self-harm, obviously. I don't do that to myself. If that's part of your practice, like pricking your finger or whatever, that's for you. But if something happens to my body physically that causes me to bleed around a full moon, I take the blood and I use it in a ritual. So excuse me. So that's not a good answer. That's not a direct answer, but I would say, for me, bleeding around a full moon or around a significant spiritual shift, I think, signifies that you can be perhaps using that blood to tip the scales in your favor in some way. At least that's how I consider it. I don't get nosebleeds, but again, I won't share what it is about my body that makes this happen. But I always consider it kind of a blessing if I bleed around a full moon or around a time that I might be doing rituals. But physically speaking, like, you might just be a person that gets nosebleeds when you're stressed, and if full moons ignite an elevated feeling inside of you, whether you realize it's a full moon or not, that could be causing the nosebleed. And then if it happens around big shifts, it could just be stress. But if you get inexplicable nosebleeds, definitely talk to a doctor about it.
Awesome. That was a way more interesting and creative response than I'm sure anyone was expecting. So you've done your job well, sir.
Extremely incoherent response to that, but I think
there's a lot there. There's a lot there. You unpacked it. And I get what you're talking about. I have psoriasis and causes bleeding. So it's a big part of my life. This absolutely. It affects even what clothes I wear or whatever. So it sucks, but such is life.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with me here, man, today. This has been great. This is wonderful. And
absolutely. Thank you for having me, especially I know you've been going through a lot, so I really appreciate you making time. And
my pleasure. And people like and subscribe the video, all that, and go check out Jacob's music. Do that right away. Moth Broth. Well, you can get it on Bandcamp or Spotify. And also, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a 5 stars and write a nice comment there on Apple Podcasts for me, folks, if you don't mind. And on Spotify, and same for Jake's work and stuff. Support us, help us in this age of suppression and chaos, and we will move forward with love in our hearts. Yeah, there we go. I never do that, but I'm doing it. There you go. Got some love. Got some love. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon, folks.